Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Crime 1, there's a certain sound wood makes when it's holding weight, something between a groan and a warning. I heard it again today near the hallway closet. It's not the usual creak of an old house settling. It's sharper, intentional. At first I thought it was just the way the boards were laid, but then I noticed the dust had shifted just slightly. A straight line like a shoe had dragged across the floor. No one had walked there. I would have seen it. I swept the area clean this morning. I remember that clearly because I spent almost an hour scrubbing the baseboards trying to distract myself. But that mark wasn't there before, and the air in that hallway, it felt heavier, like someone had just walked past me, just barely grazing my shoulder. Now I avoid that corner entirely. I pretend it's just the pipes or the cold, but deep down I know something's underneath and it wants to come out. The house came with paperwork, lots of it. The previous owner had been meticulous about repairs, renovations, every small change documented in a manila folder that sat on the kitchen counter when I moved in. I should have read it more carefully then, but I was too excited about finally owning something that felt like home. The folder is still there, though I've been through it countless times now. There's a receipt for new floorboards installed throughout the hallway. The date shows it was done just before the house went on the market. Strange timing for such a specific repair, especially since the rest of the floors were original and in decent condition. I called the contractor whose name was on the receipt. He remembered the job, said it was unusual. The previous owner had insisted on replacing just that section of flooring, claimed there was water damage. But when they pulled up the old boards, everything underneath looked perfectly dry. No rot, no staining, no sign of moisture at all. He seemed nervous, the contractor told me over the phone, kept hovering around while we worked, asking if we found anything. When we told him it was just old wood, he looked disappointed, or maybe relieved, hard to tell. The contractor's voice had that careful tone people use when they're trying not to say too much. I pressed him for more details, but he just repeated that the job was straightforward. New boards, new underlayment, sealed tight. Professional work, he assured me, though something in his voice suggested he hadn't been entirely comfortable with the project. After hanging up, I found myself staring at that hallway again. The boards looked newer than the rest, their color just slightly different. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edges. The wood felt smooth, properly installed, but there was something about the spacing. The gaps between boards seemed wider than they should be, as if whoever did the work had been in a hurry. I started noticing other things after that conversation. The way the neighbor across the street would glance at my house when she thought I wasn't looking. How mail delivery seemed to slow down when the carrier reached my mailbox, as if he was listening for something. The pizza delivery driver who refused to come to the door after dark, always insisting I meet him at the curb. There's a particular smell that comes and goes in the hallway, not unpleasant but distinctive, something organic, earthy, like soil after rain. I've checked for leaks, had the plumbing inspected, even brought in someone to look at the ventilation system. Everything checks out, but the smell persists. I decided to research the house's history. Public records showed it had been owned by the same family for over 30 years before going on the market. The previous owner's wife had passed away, and he'd lived alone for almost 2 years before selling. Natural causes, according to the obituary I found online. A brief illness survived by her loving husband. But neighbors tell a different story when you know how to ask. The couple had been having problems, they said. Loud arguments that could be heard through the walls. She'd been planning to leave, had even started packing boxes. Then she got sick suddenly, too sick to go anywhere. The neighbor who lives next door is an elderly woman who's been there for decades. She invited me over for coffee, and I could see my house from her kitchen window. She stirred her cup slowly, watching the steam rise. She was such a lovely woman, she said without prompting. Always working in her garden, had the most beautiful roses. Then she just stopped coming outside. He said she was tired, needed rest. But I never saw a doctor's car, never saw an ambulance. One day there was a funeral, and that was that. She sipped her coffee, then looked directly at me. I heard the work being done after she passed. Hammering, sawing, went on for days. Strange time to be doing home improvements, don't you think? I thanked her for the coffee and walked home with my pulse drumming in my ears. The afternoon sun was hitting the hallway at just the right angle when I opened the front door, and I could see something I'd missed before. The newer floorboards weren't just a different color, they were arranged in a specific pattern. A rectangle about 6 feet by 3 feet, perfectly centered in the hallway. That night I couldn't sleep. Every small sound seemed amplified. Every creak of the house settling made me freeze and listen. I found myself walking to the hallway, standing at the edge of those newer boards, just listening. The silence felt heavy, expectant. I started keeping a journal of the sounds, not just the obvious creaks and groans, but the subtler things. The way the air conditioning seemed to work harder when it cycled through the hallway. How my footsteps sounded different when I walked over that particular section. The way dust seemed to accumulate faster there, no matter how often I cleaned. The journal entries became more detailed as the weeks passed. I noted temperature changes, air quality, even the behavior of insects in the house. Ants avoided the hallway entirely. Spiders wouldn't build webs in the corners. Even the mice I occasionally heard in the walls seemed to give that area a wide berth. I found myself researching building codes, learning about proper floor installation, studying the techniques used to conceal irregular surfaces. The information was technical, but patterns emerged. If someone wanted to hide something beneath floorboards, they'd need to account for settling, for the way weight would distribute over time. They'd need to ensure adequate ventilation to prevent obvious odors. They'd need to make sure the repair looked professional enough to pass inspection. The previous owner's phone number was still active. I called him, told him I was having some issues with the flooring in the hallway. He was quiet for a long moment, then asked what kind of issues. His voice was careful, measured. "Just some settling," I said. The contractor mentioned there might have been water damage before the repair. I wanted to make sure there wasn't anything I should be concerned about. "No," he said quickly. "No water damage. That was just precautionary. The boards were old, needed replacing. Nothing to worry about." But I could hear something in his voice, a tightness like he was holding his breath. I asked about his wife, offered condolences. He thanked me, said she'd loved the house, especially the garden. Said she'd spent her last days there, comfortable and peaceful. "She's buried in the memorial garden across town," he added, though I hadn't asked. "Beautiful spot, very peaceful." After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the hallway. The afternoon light was fading, and shadows were beginning to stretch across the floor. I thought about his words, the way he'd volunteered information about the burial site. People don't usually specify where someone is buried unless they're trying to make a point. I drove to the memorial garden that evening. It was a well-maintained place with neat rows of headstones and carefully tended landscaping. I found her grave easily enough, a simple granite marker with her name, dates, and a brief inscription about loving wife and mother. The plot looked undisturbed, properly maintained. But as I stood there, I noticed something odd. The grass around the headstone was slightly different from the surrounding area, newer, as if it had been replanted recently, and the soil seemed looser, less settled than the adjacent graves that had been there for years. I knelt down and pressed my palm against the earth. It felt soft, yielding, not like ground that had been undisturbed for months. I looked around, making sure no one was watching, then scraped away a small section of grass. The soil underneath was dark, rich, recently turned. A groundskeeper appeared from behind a maintenance shed, startling me. He was an older man with weathered hands and a kind face. I explained that I was the new owner of the deceased woman's house, just paying my respects. "Sad case," he said, removing his cap. "Husband comes by regular, brings flowers. Nice man, very devoted. Had us replant the grass just last month. Said the original work wasn't up to his standards." He gestured toward the headstone. "Ground's been settling funny here. Happens sometimes with newer graves. We've had to add soil a few times, reseed the grass. He's particular about how it looks." I thanked him and walked back to my car with my thoughts racing. The timeline was bothering me. The woman had died, been buried, and within weeks her husband was replacing floorboards in their house. Then months later, he was having the grave site re-landscaped. Too many coincidences, too much attention to soil and ground settling. Back home, I found myself staring at the hallway again. The evening light was hitting the boards at a different angle, and I could see slight variations in the wood grain. Most of the boards ran parallel to the walls, but in the rectangular section, they formed a different pattern, more like a border or a frame. I got down on my hands and knees and examined the edges more carefully. The gaps between boards were indeed wider than standard, and when I pressed my ear to the floor, I could hear something that might have been air movement underneath. Not the usual dead space beneath floorboards, but something more open. That night I dreamed about gardens, rich, dark soil and the smell of roses. But when I tried to walk through the garden, my feet kept sinking into the earth deeper and deeper until I was afraid I'd never find solid ground again. I woke with dirt under my fingernails, though I was sure I'd washed my hands before bed. The hallway was silent, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. I wrapped a robe around myself and padded barefoot to the kitchen, avoiding the hallway entirely. The manila folder was still on the counter, and I spread its contents across the table. Receipts, permits, inspection reports, but there was something I'd missed before, a handwritten note tucked between the contractor's estimate and the final bill. The writing was shaky, urgent. "Make sure it's deep enough. Can't have any settling. This has to be permanent." The note wasn't signed, but the handwriting matched the signature on the other documents. The previous owner had been very specific about the depth requirements for the floor repair, not just replacing boards, but ensuring whatever was underneath stayed there. I called the contractor again, told him I'd found the note. He was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't know what that job was really about," he said, but the guy was adamant about the depth, had us dig down much deeper than necessary for a simple floor repair. Said he wanted to make sure there was no chance of future settling. We thought it was overkill, but he was paying. "How deep?" I asked. "Deep enough," he said, and his voice had that careful tone again. Deep enough for whatever he was worried about. After hanging up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath. I thought about the woman in the garden, the way she'd suddenly stopped coming outside. I thought about her husband's nervousness during the renovation, his insistence on proper burial depths. I thought about the smell in the hallway, organic and earthy, about the way the floorboards seemed to shift slightly when I walked over them, about the sound of settling that wasn't quite settling. The logical part of my mind kept insisting I was imagining things, creating connections that weren't there, but my body knew better. The way my pulse quickened when I approached the hallway, the way my skin crawled when I stood over that rectangular section of newer boards. I've been avoiding the hallway for weeks now. I use the back entrance, sleep in the guest room, pretend that part of the house doesn't exist. But I can still hear it sometimes, that sound of wood under pressure, of something shifting in the darkness below. And I know that sooner or later I'm going to have to decide what to do about it, whether to call the police or the contractor or just pack up and leave, whether to lift those boards and see what's underneath or let sleeping secrets lie. The floorboard moved again today, just slightly, but enough to catch my eye, enough to remind me that some truths are buried for a reason and some graves are meant to stay undisturbed. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know, need someone to understand that the house remembers even when we try to forget. The wood remembers the weight it carries. The soil remembers what it holds. And if something happens to me, if I disappear like she did, someone should know where to look. Someone should know that the garden wasn't the only place he buried his secrets. The hallway is waiting. It's been waiting all along. Crime 2, I was repainting the hallway to feel productive, covering up old stains, changing the tone of the place. Everything went smoothly until I reached the patch near the linen closet. The brush dragged like it was catching on something underneath. Curious, I scraped a bit with the edge of a putty knife. That's when I saw the first line, thin, deliberate, carved into the drywall, not accidental. Someone had etched it there, then covered it up. As I kept chipping, more marks appeared, crossed lines, deep grooves, symbols maybe, or names. They were all clustered low, at child height. The air felt wrong in that hallway after that. The paint refused to dry. The lights flickered every time I walked past, and even now when I'm standing in the kitchen, I can hear faint scratching, like something wants me to finish uncovering the rest. The previous owner had been eager to sell, too eager. I remembered her nervous laugh when she handed me the keys, the way she avoided looking at the hallway altogether. She'd moved out before our final walkthrough, leaving behind only the lingering scent of bleach and vanilla candles, an odd combination that made my throat tighten. I called my neighbor, an elderly woman who lived next door for decades. She invited me over for coffee, her fingers trembling slightly as she poured. When I mentioned the scratches, her cup rattled against the saucer. There was a family, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before the woman you bought from, they had children, 3 of them I think. The youngest was small, maybe 5 or 6. She paused, staring into her coffee. They moved out suddenly, middle of the night. I heard crying from that house for weeks afterward, but when I looked, no one was there. That evening I returned to the hallway with a flashlight and a scraping tool. The scratches revealed themselves slowly, like secrets reluctant to surface. Some were letters, crude, uneven, as if carved by small hands. Others were tally marks, grouped in sets of 5. I counted them obsessively, losing track, starting over. The smell of bleach grew stronger as I worked. It seemed to seep from the walls themselves, mixing with something else, something sweet and rotting that made my stomach turn. I opened every window, but the odor clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. Among the scratches, I found a name repeated multiple times. Help, Below it, in smaller letters, cold, and lower still, barely visible, hungry. I stopped scraping, my hands were shaking. The next morning I visited the local library. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes behind thick glasses, helped me search through old newspaper archives. We found nothing about the previous family, no missing persons reports, no incidents. It was as if they'd never existed. But tucked between the pages of a community newsletter from several years back, I found a small advertisement. Babysitting services available, experienced with special needs children, references upon request. The phone number was disconnected. I began asking around the neighborhood more deliberately. The mailman remembered the family, quiet children who rarely played outside. The woman at the corner store recalled them buying unusual amounts of cleaning supplies, always bleach, always paid in cash. Each conversation left me with more questions. The children's father worked long hours, traveled frequently. The mother was described as nervous, jumpy, always watching the windows. Neighbors assumed she was anxious about break-ins, but now I wondered if she was watching for something else. I found myself returning to the hallway obsessively. The scratches seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking. New marks appeared overnight, desperate gouges that went deeper than children's fingernails could manage. The paint I'd applied days earlier was peeling, revealing fresh carvings underneath. In the basement, I discovered a small room I'd somehow missed during the initial inspection. The door was hidden behind a false wall panel, camouflaged with the same paint as the rest of the basement. Inside, the walls were covered in the same scratches, but these were different, more frantic, overlapping in chaotic patterns. The floor was stained with something dark that had seeped into the concrete. The smell of bleach was overwhelming here, mixed with the sweet decay that had been haunting the house. In the corner, I found a small shoe, a child's sneaker, worn thin at the toe. I sat in that room for what felt like hours, my mind racing. The scratches weren't random. They were a record, a countdown, a plea for help that no one had heard. I called the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd found scratches under paint, that a house smelled like bleach. The officer who came was polite but dismissive. No crime had been reported at this address. No missing persons cases matched my description. The previous owners had every right to paint over their walls. But I knew what I was seeing. Those marks weren't made by children playing. They were made by children hiding, waiting, praying for someone to find them. I began documenting everything. Photographs of the scratches, measurements of the hidden room, samples of the stained concrete. The evidence told a story I didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. The neighbor woman called me a few days later. Her voice was different, frightened, urgent. She'd remembered something else about the family. The children had gotten thinner near the end, she said. They'd stopped going to school. The mother claimed they were being homeschooled, but no one ever saw them with books or supplies. I should have called someone, she whispered. I should have done something. I hung up and stared at the scratches on my wall. They stared back, accusing. All those marks, all those desperate attempts to communicate, and no one had listened. No one had looked close enough to see the truth hiding underneath the surface. The house feels different now. The scratches have stopped appearing, but their silence is somehow worse than their presence. I've stopped trying to paint over them. They deserve to be seen. They deserve to be remembered. I still live here in this house that holds its secrets close. I've learned to sleep with the sounds it makes, the settling, the creaking, the occasional scratch that might be pipes or might be something else entirely. I've become its guardian, its witness. Sometimes I wonder if the children are still here somehow. if they're watching me tend to their messages, grateful that someone finally stopped to listen, or if they moved on long ago, leaving only their desperate words carved into the walls like a warning. I don't know what happened to them, I don't know if I ever will, but I know they existed, I know they tried to tell someone, and I know that somewhere the person who made them disappear is still walking free, still smiling, still sleeping soundly at night. The scratches under the paint were just the beginning. Every house has its secrets, every family has its darkness. And sometimes, if you look closely enough, you can see where the truth has been painted over, buried beneath layers of denial and time. But the truth always finds a way to surface. It always leaves marks. And if you're patient enough, if you're willing to scrape away the comfortable lies, you'll find it waiting underneath. The scratches are still there, they always will be. And every time someone new moves into a house, every time someone decides to renovate or redecorate, I wonder what they might find hiding beneath the surface. What stories are waiting to be uncovered? What children are still calling for help from behind fresh coats of paint? I listen now, I pay attention, I look for the signs that others miss. Because those scratches taught me something important. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone covers it up. It just waits, patient and persistent, for someone brave enough to dig deeper. The house has taught me to be that someone, to be the one who doesn't look away, to be the one who remembers that behind every perfect surface, there might be desperate hands carving out a final message. There were scratches under the paint, there still are. And I'll keep watching, keep listening, keep bearing witness to the stories that others would rather forget. Because someone needs to remember, someone needs to care, someone needs to make sure that the children who tried so hard to tell us what was happening aren't forgotten in the silence that followed. The scratches are evidence, they're proof. They're a reminder that evil hides in plain sight, covered by layers of normalcy and respectability, but it always leaves marks, it always leaves traces. And if you know how to look, if you know what to listen for, you can find them. The truth is always there, waiting beneath the surface. You just have to be willing to scrape away the paint. Crime 3, when I first stepped into the guest room, it smelled stale, like air that hadn't moved in weeks. The curtains were shut tight, though I didn't remember closing them. The bed looked off. The mattress had been flipped, but not in a way that made sense. It was standing upright, pressed flat against the wall, sheets still half tucked under it, like someone had tried to remake the bed vertically. There were indentations on the carpet, but not where the bed should have been. Worse, the baseboard behind it had a long, dark smear that trailed into the corner. Something had been dragged, or someone. I haven't touched it since, I just shut the door. But I swear I keep hearing the soft thud of fabric shifting, like the mattress is slowly falling forward again, waiting to reveal what's behind it. The whole thing started when my brother's girlfriend disappeared. Not disappeared in the dramatic sense, she just stopped coming around, stopped answering texts. Her car vanished from the driveway where it usually sat, oil stains marking its regular spot like a ghost's outline. My brother acted like nothing happened. He'd hum while making coffee, scroll through his phone with the same vacant expression he'd worn for months. When I asked about her, he'd shrug and say she was probably visiting family. But his eyes would dart toward the guest room door, just for a second, before settling back on whatever mindless task occupied his hands. The smell got worse over the following days. Not just stale air now, something sweeter, more organic, like fruit left too long in a warm car. I started keeping my bedroom door closed, but the scent seemed to seep through the walls, following me into dreams where I'd find myself standing in that room, staring at the vertical mattress, afraid to move it. I began paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way my brother's laundry routine had changed. He'd started washing clothes in the middle of the night, the machine's hum cutting through the silence like a mechanical heartbeat. The way he'd developed a habit of checking locks, testing door handles twice before bed. The way he'd started buying bleach in bulk, though our house had never been particularly clean. The girlfriend had been staying with us for months before her disappearance. She was quiet, always reading paperback novels with bent covers, drinking tea from the same chipped mug. She'd leave strands of dark hair on the bathroom sink, small reminders of her presence that I'd grown accustomed to seeing. Now those traces were gone, as if she'd never existed at all. But traces of something else had appeared. Scratches on the hardwood floor leading from the guest room to the back door. Deep gouges that hadn't been there before, as if something heavy had been dragged across the surface. When I mentioned them to my brother, he said we'd probably damaged the floor moving furniture months ago. His voice carried that same casual dismissal, but his fingers drummed against his thigh in a rhythm that seemed anxious, desperate. I started listening more carefully at night. The house had always been old, full of settling sounds and creaking wood, but now I heard other things. Muffled thumps from the guest room as if something inside was shifting position. The soft whisper of fabric against drywall. Sometimes what sounded like scratching fingernails against wood or plaster. My brother's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd leave the house at odd hours, returning with muddy shoes and dirt under his fingernails. He'd claim he'd been gardening, but our yard remained as neglected as ever. The only new feature was a patch of recently turned earth near the back fence where he said he'd planted tomatoes. But it was the wrong season for tomatoes, and the soil looked too disturbed, too hastily smooth. The girlfriend's personal belongings had vanished gradually. First, her toothbrush disappeared from the bathroom counter. Then her books stopped appearing on the coffee table. Her favorite sweater, which she'd left draped over the dining room chair, was gone one morning without explanation. When I asked about these disappearances, my brother would look confused, as if he genuinely couldn't remember her having owned such things. But the guest room remained untouched. The mattress still stood against the wall, sheets still half-tucked, still defying gravity and logic. I'd catch my brother standing in the doorway sometimes, staring at it with an expression I couldn't read. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. Something that suggested he was waiting for something to happen, or for someone to discover something he'd hidden. I began researching missing persons cases, scrolling through databases of unsolved disappearances. The patterns were depressingly familiar. Women who vanished without warning, leaving behind confused families and unanswered questions. Most cases went cold within weeks, relegated to back pages of local newspapers and forgotten by everyone except those who'd loved the missing person. The girlfriend's absence started feeling less like a choice and more like a conclusion. Her silence wasn't mysterious anymore, it was final. The way my brother had stopped mentioning her name, stopped checking his phone for messages, stopped glancing hopefully at the driveway. He'd moved past waiting for her return to accepting her absence as permanent. I decided to search her room while my brother was out. The guest room door had been locked, but I found the key in his dresser drawer, hidden under a stack of old photographs. The lock turned easily, as if it had been used recently and often. Inside, the smell was overwhelming, sweet and putrid, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The mattress loomed against the wall, casting a shadow that seemed to move independently of the light. But it was the floor behind it that made my stomach clench with recognition and dread. The baseboard wasn't just smeared with darkness, it was stained with something that had dried into rust-colored patterns. spatter marks that suggested impact, struggle, violence. The carpet beneath showed signs of serious cleaning, but bleach couldn't erase everything. Dark patches remained, irregular shapes that told a story I didn't want to understand. I found her jewelry hidden in the closet, wrapped in one of my brother's old t-shirts. The necklace she'd worn every day, the earrings she'd fidgeted with while reading. Her driver's license was there too, bent and water-damaged, her photo smiling up at me from what felt like another lifetime. But it was the recording device I found that changed everything. A small digital recorder, the kind used for interviews or lectures, hidden behind a stack of towels. When I pressed play, her voice filled the room, scared, breathless, urgent. She was talking about my brother, about his behavior, about threats he'd made, about how she'd started documenting their conversations because she was afraid of what he might do. The recording cut off abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. But in that silence I heard something else. The soft thud of fabric shifting, the whisper of sheets against drywall. The mattress was moving, slowly sliding down the wall, revealing more of what lay hidden behind it. I didn't stay to see what the mattress concealed. I grabbed the recorder and jewelry, locked the door, and left the house. But I kept the key, kept the evidence, kept the terrible knowledge that some disappearances aren't mysteries at all. My brother still lives in that house. He still hums while making coffee, still scrolls through his phone with vacant eyes. But he stopped checking the guest room door, stopped listening for sounds that will never come. He's learned to live with the silence, with the absence, with the weight of what he's hidden behind that vertical mattress. I never reported what I found, never turned in the evidence, never called the authorities, because some truths are too terrible to voice, some knowledge too dangerous to share. Because my brother is still my brother, and family bonds are stronger than justice, stronger than the need to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The recording device sits in my drawer now, her voice trapped inside like a confession waiting to be heard. But I know I'll never press play again, never let her words fill another room with their desperate urgency. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, some disappearances are meant to remain unsolved. The mattress is probably still standing against the wall, still hiding what lies behind it. And my brother still lives with the knowledge of what he's done, still hums while making coffee, still pretends that some people just disappear without reason or consequence. But I know the truth now. I know that disappearances aren't always mysteries, that some people vanish because someone else decides they should. I know that the absence of evidence isn't the same as innocence, that silence can be more damning than any confession. And I know that I've become complicit in something terrible, something that will follow me for the rest of my life. Because choosing family over justice, choosing silence over truth, makes me almost as guilty as the person who made that choice necessary in the first place. The mattress is still facing the wall, and I'm still keeping its secrets. Crime 4, I found it at a flea market, a small, ornate mirror with carvings too intricate for the price they were asking. I brought it home and hung it in the hallway opposite the stairwell. It looked beautiful for a while. Then I started noticing things. The reflection was too slow. When I walked past, there was always a half-second delay, just enough to make me stop and check. But that wasn't the worst part. One night I caught sight of someone standing behind me, just a shape, no face, but when I turned around, the hallway was empty. Now I keep a blanket draped over it, but every morning it's pulled off again, folded neatly on the floor, like the mirror wants to be seen. Or worse, wants me to look. The seller had been an elderly woman with paper-thin skin and fingers that moved too deliberately when she counted my money. She'd wrapped the mirror in old newspaper, the kind that leaves ink stains on your hands. I should have read the headlines then, but I was too focused on getting home before the weather turned. It wasn't until weeks later that I found those newspaper clippings still tucked behind the mirror's backing. 3 different articles, all from the same week, all about the same family. A mother, father, and teenage daughter who had vanished from their home without explanation. Their belongings remained untouched, doors unlocked, food still warm on the table. The house had been sold quickly, the article mentioned. Estate sale handled by a local auction company. Personal effects distributed to various vendors and flea markets throughout the region. I began to understand why the mirror had been priced so low. The reflection delays became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of rooms that weren't quite right, furniture arranged differently, walls painted colors I'd never chosen. Sometimes I'd see a figure moving through spaces that should have been empty, always just at the edge of vision, never clear enough to identify. I started keeping a journal documenting each occurrence. The entries became obsessive, filled with sketches of what I thought I'd seen, measurements of angles and lighting conditions. My handwriting grew increasingly erratic as I tried to capture details that seemed to slip away the moment I looked directly at them. The breakthrough came when I decided to research the previous owners. Public records showed the house had belonged to a family matching the description in those newspaper articles. The daughter had been about my age when they disappeared. Her room had been in the same location where I'd hung the mirror. I found her social media accounts still active despite her absence. The posts had continued for months after the disappearance, mundane updates about daily life, photos of places she couldn't possibly have been. The IP address traced back to her family's home, even though it stood empty. The final post was a photograph of a mirror, the same mirror now hanging in my hallway, but in the reflection I could see a room I'd never been in, with furniture I'd never owned. And standing in the background, barely visible, was a figure I was beginning to recognize. I contacted the detective who had handled the case. He was retired now, but agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed my journal entries, and his voice dropped to a whisper when he spoke about the investigation. They'd found something in the house, he told me, something that had never made it into the official reports. The family's mirrors, all of them, had been covered with blankets when police arrived, except for one small mirror in the daughter's room, which had been removed entirely. The wall behind it bore strange markings, as if someone had been scratching at the surface for days. The detective had kept photographs from the scene, images that had been deemed irrelevant to the case. He showed me one, the daughter's bedroom, with a rectangular outline on the wall where something had been hanging. The dimensions matched my mirror exactly. But it was the next photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed the same room, but from a different angle. In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure I recognized. Not the daughter, not any member of the family. It was me. I returned home that night with a new understanding of what I was dealing with. The mirror wasn't just reflecting the present, it was showing me moments from the past, fragments of time that had become trapped in its surface. And somehow, I had become part of that trapped time. The blanket I draped over the mirror stayed in place that night, but when I woke, I found something else. A photograph slipped under my door, printed on the same cheap paper the newspaper had been wrapped in. It showed my hallway, but from an angle that would have been impossible to achieve from any position in my house. In the reflection of the mirror, I could see myself sleeping in my bedroom, but I was also standing in the hallway, watching myself sleep. I realized then that I wasn't just seeing the past through the mirror, I was becoming part of it. The figure I'd been glimpsing in the reflection wasn't a ghost or an intruder. It was me, caught in the same temporal loop that had trapped the family before me. The detective's investigation notes, which he'd shared reluctantly, contained details that had never been made public. The family hadn't simply vanished, they'd been found eventually, but not in the way anyone expected. They were discovered in their own home, in their own beds, as if they'd never left, but they were different, older. They spoke of living in the house for years, decades even, though only weeks had passed since their disappearance. The mirror had been removed from the scene immediately after their return. No one had wanted to investigate further. The family was relocated quietly, their identities changed. The house was sold to eliminate any remaining connections to the incident. But the mirror had survived, passed from one unwitting owner to the next, and now it was showing me what I was becoming. I stopped covering the mirror. Instead, I began to study it, to understand the pattern of its reflections. I documented every anomaly, every glimpse of displaced time. I learned to recognize the signs that preceded each episode, the slight change in air pressure, the way dust motes seemed to hang suspended, the subtle shift in the quality of light. The journal entries became my anchor to the present. As long as I kept writing, kept documenting what I was experiencing, I could maintain some connection to my own timeline, but I could feel myself slipping. The person in the mirror was becoming more real than the person writing in the journal. I tried to contact the family who had been found in their home. Through public records and careful investigation, I traced them to a small town several states away. They were living under new names in a house with no mirrors at all. When I called, the daughter answered. Her voice was exactly as I'd imagined it would be. She listened to my story without interruption. When I finished, there was a long silence before she spoke. "You can't destroy it," she said finally. "We tried. Fire won't touch it. Impact won't crack it. It exists in too many places at once. All you can do is pass it on." "What happens if I don't?" "You become the person in the reflection completely, and someone else becomes you." I understood then why the mirror had been priced so low at the flea market. It wasn't meant to be expensive. It was meant to be attractive, irresistible to someone who would take it home without questions. The woman who sold it to me hadn't been its owner. She'd been its victim, trying to pass it on to someone else before it was too late. The paper-thin skin, the deliberate movements, she'd been fading, becoming less real with each passing day. I began to prepare for my own fading. I organized my affairs, wrote letters to family members explaining my absence in terms they might accept. I researched flea markets and auction houses, places where I could ensure the mirror would find its next owner quickly. But as I prepared to let go, I realized something else. The mirror wasn't just trapping people in time, it was collecting them. Each reflection contained fragments of everyone who had owned it. The daughter I'd seen in the photographs, the elderly woman who'd sold it to me, dozens of others stretching back through decades. We were all there, all watching, all waiting. The mirror had become a repository of displaced lives, a catalog of people who had been removed from their proper timelines. And somewhere in its depths, the real answers to all our disappearances were waiting to be discovered. I made a decision then. Instead of passing the mirror on, I would study it. I would document everything it showed me, every glimpse of the past and future it revealed. I would become the keeper of its secrets, the chronicler of its victims. The journal entries continue, though I'm no longer certain who is writing them. The person in the mirror has become more substantial, more real, while I fade a little more each day. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in other reflective surfaces and see only a suggestion of a person, a shadow that might have been someone once. But I keep writing, keep documenting, keep searching for the truth that lies beneath the surface of the mirror, because somewhere in its depths, I believe, is the key to understanding what happened to all of us. The real crime isn't the disappearances, it's the gradual erasure of our existence, the way we're slowly being written out of the world while our reflections live on. The mirror hangs in my hallway still, uncovered now. I no longer try to hide from what it shows me. Instead, I watch and wait and document, knowing that someday someone will find my journal and understand what really happened here. They'll see the truth that has been hidden in plain sight, reflected in the surface of a mirror that should never have been sold. The blanket lies folded on the floor where I left it. I don't remember pulling it off the mirror, but I must have. Or perhaps the mirror pulled it off itself, eager to be seen one more time before the final reflection takes hold. Crime 5, it started with a low hum like electricity but off-key. I thought it was a wiring issue, maybe a loose outlet, but it didn't come from the wall socket, it came from the drywall itself. I pressed my ear against it. Behind the surface I could hear something breathing, shallow, uneven, like whatever was in there wasn't supposed to be. I punched a hole in the plaster one night, desperate to know, just a small hole, enough to see darkness and insulation and a single fingernail embedded between the beams like it had been clawing its way out. I patched it immediately, pretended it never happened, but now the hum has turned into whispers, and sometimes when I walk past that wall, I feel something tapping back. The house came with a history nobody wanted to discuss. The realtor's smile faltered when I asked about the previous owners. She shuffled papers, mentioned a family emergency, a quick sale. The price was too good to ignore, and I needed a fresh start after the divorce. The wall in question separated the living room from what used to be a bedroom. The layout felt wrong from the beginning, too narrow, like someone had shortened the space deliberately. I measured both sides and found a 3-foot discrepancy. Behind that wall, there was a gap that shouldn't exist. I started asking neighbors about the family who lived here before. The woman next door, elderly with trembling hands, invited me in for coffee. Her kitchen smelled of lavender and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my throat close up. She told me about the daughter, a teenager who had problems, she said, always getting into trouble, staying out late, bringing home the wrong kind of people. The parents were strict, religious, the kind who believed in discipline and prayer as solutions to everything. The girl disappeared one winter, just vanished. The parents reported her as a runaway, said she'd been threatening to leave for months. The police investigated, but teenagers run away all the time, especially the troubled ones. I found the girl's social media profile still active. Posts stopped abruptly, mid-conversation with friends. Her last message was to someone asking if she was okay. She typed back, "I'm fine, just grounded, can't leave my room." That message was sent 3 days after her parents reported her missing. The investigation records were public. I spent hours reading witness statements, police reports, interview transcripts. The parents' story never changed. She was angry, rebellious, had been planning to leave. They'd tried to help her, but she was beyond saving. Her friends told different stories. They said she'd been scared that her parents had become increasingly controlling. She'd missed school, stopped answering calls. When they went to the house, her parents said she was sick, couldn't have visitors. The boyfriend gave the most disturbing account. He tried to see her, climbing up to her bedroom window like he'd done before, but the window was boarded up from the inside. When he called out to her, he heard what sounded like muffled crying. Then her father appeared with a flashlight, chasing him away. The police never found her body. The case went cold. The parents moved away within a year, selling the house quickly, quietly. The realtor's records showed they'd done some renovation work before the sale, interior walls mainly. I hired a contractor to open the wall properly, professional, careful. I told him I was looking for electrical issues, maybe a water leak. He brought equipment, cameras, proper tools. The space behind the wall was small, cramped, about 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, just enough room for someone to stand or crouch. The insulation was disturbed, pushed aside. Scratches marked the wooden beams, deep gouges that looked like fingernails dragged across the surface. We found fabric fibers, strands of long brown hair, and something else that made the contractor step back and reach for his phone. I stopped him, told him I'd handle it, paid him extra to forget what he'd seen. The bones were small, delicate, arranged in a position that suggested someone had been sitting, knees drawn up back against the wall. The skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, a single crack across the temporal bone, consistent with being struck by something heavy. I should have called the police immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way the contractor had looked at me, like I was somehow responsible. Or maybe it was the realization that if I reported this, I'd become part of the story. The new owner who found the body, the one who brought the past back to life. Instead, I researched the parents, found them living in another state, new identities, new lives. The father worked at a hardware store. The mother volunteered at a church. They'd moved on, built something new over the foundation of their old life. I called them, pretended to be a journalist working on a documentary about cold cases. The mother hung up immediately, but the father talked. His voice was different than I'd expected, tired, hollow, like he'd been waiting for this call. He told me about the shame, how the community had turned against them when their daughter disappeared, how people whispered, pointed, made accusations. They'd loved her, he said, tried to help her, but she was beyond saving. When I mentioned the wall, there was a long silence. Then he said something that made my blood freeze. Sometimes love means making hard choices. Sometimes it means keeping people safe from themselves. I hung up, sat in the dark, staring at the patched wall. The humming had stopped. The whispers were gone, but I could still feel something there waiting. The girl's name was in the missing person report, but I can't bring myself to use it. Names have power, make things real, and part of me wants to keep this contained, locked away like she was. I've been living with this knowledge for months now. The bones are still there behind the wall. I patched it up, painted over it, hung a picture to cover the area. But I can't escape the feeling that I'm complicit now, that by not reporting it, I've become part of the crime. The neighbors still ask about the house, how I'm settling in. The elderly woman next door brings me casseroles, asks if I've heard any strange noises. There's something knowing in her eyes, like she's been waiting for someone to discover what we all suspected. I found a journal in the attic, the girl's journal. Her handwriting became increasingly erratic toward the end, describing how the walls were closing in, how she couldn't breathe. Her parents had put locks on her door, bars on her windows. They said it was for her own protection, to keep the bad influences out. The last entry was different, desperate. She'd figured out their plan. They weren't trying to help her anymore. They were trying to make her disappear. I should feel something more than this numbness. anger maybe, or determination to seek justice. But instead, I feel like I'm sinking into the same silence that swallowed her, the same willful blindness that let her disappear without a trace. The humming has started again, softer now, almost like a lullaby, and sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear what sounds like forgiveness, like she understands why I can't bring myself to disturb her rest. The wall holds its secrets, and I hold mine, in this house where love became imprisonment, where protection became murder, where a girl became a ghost in her own home. The truth is buried here 3 feet behind the living room wall, but some truths are too heavy to carry, too dangerous to speak. Some stories are meant to stay hidden, humming quietly in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. I'm not that person, I'm just the one who found her and chose to let her stay lost. Crime 6, the recording started as background noise, faint sounds coming from the baby monitor I'd kept in the storage closet for years. I never turned it on, had no reason to, but somehow it powered up on its own, blinking red. What I heard was not static, it was a voice, whispering, saying things I hadn't told anyone, things I'd only thought, regrets, memories. At first, I convinced myself it was picking up interference, a neighbor's signal maybe, but then it started using my exact phrasing, words I only say in my head. Now I keep it unplugged, but even when I take the batteries out, it still turns on, still speaks, and it's starting to ask questions I don't want to answer. The voice first mentioned her name on a Tuesday. I was washing dishes, letting the warm water run over my hands longer than necessary when I heard it clearly through the static. Not just her name, but the way I used to say it. Soft, careful, like handling something fragile. I dropped the plate. The sound of ceramic hitting the sink was sharp, final. The kind of sound that cuts through everything else and leaves you standing in sudden silence. But the monitor kept talking. It knew about the letter I never sent. The one I wrote after the funeral, when everyone had gone home and I was left alone with my thoughts and a bottle of wine that tasted like copper pennies. I'd burned that letter, watched the edges curl black in the kitchen sink, but somehow the voice knew every word. The next morning I called the police station, asked to speak with the detective who'd handled her case. They transferred me 3 times before someone finally told me he'd retired, moved away, left no forwarding information. The woman on the phone sounded tired, like she'd had this conversation before. I hung up and stared at the monitor. It sat silent on my kitchen table, innocent as a sleeping cat, but I could feel it waiting, listening, recording things I hadn't even realized I was thinking. The investigation had been brief, open and shut, they called it, a break-in gone wrong. She'd surprised the intruder, they said, fought back. The evidence was clear enough, broken window, missing jewelry, signs of a struggle in the living room where they found her. But I knew something they didn't, something I'd never told anyone because it seemed too small, too insignificant to matter. The detail that had been eating at me for months, growing larger in my mind like a shadow at sunset. I'd been there that afternoon, not inside her house, but close enough to see the windows. I'd parked across the street, engine running, trying to work up the courage to knock on her door. We'd argued the week before. Something stupid about money, about choices, about the way she always made me feel like I was apologizing for existing. I sat in that car for maybe 20 minutes, watching her move past the windows. She was on the phone, pacing, animated, angry maybe. Her gestures were sharp, frustrated. I'd seen her like that before, usually when she was talking to him. The man she'd been seeing, the one she wouldn't talk about, the one who called at strange hours and made her voice drop to a whisper when she answered. I'd heard him once in the background of a conversation. Deep voice, careful words, the kind of person who measured everything before speaking. I never saw who she was talking to that day, but I saw her hang up. Saw her throw the phone onto the couch with the kind of force that meant the conversation hadn't gone well. That was when I decided to leave, to try again another day when she might be in a better mood. The monitor crackled, the voice spoke again, clearer now. It asked me about the car, the one I'd seen pulling away as I turned the corner. Dark sedan, tinted windows, nothing remarkable about it except the way it moved. Slow, deliberate, like the driver was thinking about something. I'd forgotten about that car until now, but the voice remembered. It remembered everything. The newspapers had been full of speculation. Young woman living alone, victim of random violence. The kind of story that made people check their locks twice before bed. But random violence leaves different kinds of evidence, messy evidence, desperate evidence. What they found in her house was too clean, too purposeful. The broken window was on the wrong side. The jewelry that was missing was the expensive stuff, the pieces someone would know to look for, and the struggle in the living room looked staged. Furniture overturned in ways that didn't match the story they were telling. I started making calls, casual questions to mutual friends. Had anyone seen her recently? Had she mentioned anything unusual? Was she worried about anything? The answers came back in fragments. She'd been nervous, distracted, looking over her shoulder when she walked to her car. She'd asked one friend about changing her locks, asked another about security systems. Small things, the kind of details that get lost in the chaos after something terrible happens. But the voice on the monitor knew about those details. It knew about the text messages she'd deleted, the ones she'd shown me on her phone, scrolling through them quickly before deleting them. Messages from someone who knew too much about her schedule, about when she'd be home, about when she'd be alone. I'd thought it was an ex-boyfriend, someone she was trying to shake off. We'd laughed about it, made jokes about stalkers and restraining orders, but she'd looked worried when she thought I wasn't watching, really worried. The monitor started playing recordings, not of her voice but of mine, conversations I'd forgotten. Phone calls from weeks before she died. I heard myself asking about her mood, about whether she was sleeping well. I heard her making excuses, changing the subject, ending calls abruptly. In one recording, I heard her say something that stopped my breath. She was talking about a key. Someone had asked her for a spare key to her house, someone she trusted, someone who had a reason to need access when she wasn't there. I'd forgotten about that conversation completely, but listening to it now, I could hear something in her voice that I'd missed before. Hesitation, doubt, the sound of someone who was starting to realize they might have made a mistake. The investigation file was public record. I drove to the courthouse, filled out the forms, paid the fees. The clerk was friendly, chatty. She told me about other cases, about how crime had changed over the years, how criminals were getting smarter, more sophisticated. The file was thinner than I'd expected. Basic crime scene photos, interview notes, a list of evidence that seemed surprisingly short for a case they'd closed so quickly. But buried in the paperwork was something interesting, a note about a partial fingerprint they'd found on the window frame, the broken window that was supposed to be the point of entry. The fingerprint didn't match any known criminals, but it also didn't match the victim. It was filed away as inconclusive, not enough points for a positive identification, the kind of evidence that gets forgotten when a case needs to be closed. I stared at that note for a long time, thought about hands I'd seen, hands that had touched that window, hands that belonged to someone who had legitimate reasons to be in her house, someone who wouldn't arouse suspicion if neighbors saw them coming and going. The monitor was waiting for me when I got home. It started speaking before I even set down my keys. This time it played a recording of her voice, not from our phone calls, but from somewhere else, somewhere I'd never heard her before. She was crying, begging, asking someone to leave her alone, promising she wouldn't tell anyone about something. The recording was short, cut off abruptly, but I could hear fear in her voice, real fear, the kind that comes from knowing you're in danger and not knowing how to get out. I called the police station again, asked to speak with someone about reopening the case. They transferred me to a detective who listened patiently while I explained about the monitor, about the recordings, about the fingerprint that didn't match anyone. He was polite, professional. He took my name and number and promised to look into it, but I could hear skepticism in his voice, the kind of tone people use when they're talking to someone who's clearly lost touch with reality. I hung up and realized I was alone with this. Whatever was happening, whatever truth was hidden in those recordings, I was the only one who could hear it, the only one who would listen. The monitor played another recording. This one was different, clearer, more recent. It was a conversation between two people, a man and a woman. The woman was her. The man was someone I didn't recognize, but his voice was familiar, deep, careful, measured. They were arguing about money, about promises that had been broken, about consequences that neither of them wanted to face. The man was calm, controlled. The woman was desperate, pleading. She mentioned the police, said she was thinking about talking to them about something that had happened. The man's voice changed, became colder, more threatening. He reminded her about things she'd done, mistakes she'd made, people who would be hurt if certain information became public. The conversation ended with silence, the kind of silence that feels like a door closing. I played the recording again and again. Each time I heard something new, a word, a phrase, an inflection that reminded me of someone I'd met, someone who'd been at the funeral, someone who'd known exactly what to say to make me feel better. The realization came slowly, like watching sunrise through thick clouds. The voice on the recording belonged to someone I knew, someone who'd comforted me after she died, someone who'd asked careful questions about what she might have told me, someone who'd been very interested in whether she'd left any letters or messages. I thought about the spare key, about the fingerprint on the window, about the way the crime scene had been staged to look like a burglary, about the missing jewelry that only someone close to her would know was valuable. The monitor crackled again. This time it played the sound of typing, computer keys being pressed, the sound of someone searching through files, looking for something, deleting something. The typing stopped, a door closed, footsteps walked away. I understood now. The monitor wasn't just playing random recordings. It was telling me a story, showing me pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered and hidden, evidence that had been overlooked or ignored or deliberately concealed. But understanding the truth and proving it were different things. The recordings could be explained away, dismissed as electronic interference or the product of a grieving mind. The fingerprint was inconclusive. The behavioral evidence was circumstantial. And there was something else, something that made my hands shake when I thought about it. If the voice on the monitor was right, if the person who killed her was someone I knew, someone I trusted, then they knew I was investigating. They knew I was asking questions. They knew I was getting close to something they'd killed to keep secret. The monitor went silent. The red light stopped blinking. For the first time in days, there was complete quiet in my house, but the silence felt heavier than the voice had been, more threatening, like the calm before a storm. I sat in my kitchen and thought about choices. about what happens when you know something you're not supposed to know, about the difference between justice and revenge, about the weight of secrets and the price of truth. The voice had given me answers, but it had also given me a responsibility I wasn't sure I wanted, because knowing who killed her meant knowing I was probably next, and knowing I was probably next meant deciding whether to run or fight or simply wait for the inevitable. I looked at the monitor, silent, innocent, just an old piece of baby equipment that had somehow become the repository for secrets no one was supposed to hear. I thought about unplugging it permanently, about throwing it away, about pretending none of this had happened. But her voice was still in my head, not from the monitor, but from my memories, laughing, crying, asking me to remember her, to make sure someone knew the truth about what happened to her. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd memorized, the person who'd been so helpful after the funeral, so concerned about my well-being, so interested in whether I was doing okay, so careful to ask the right questions. The voice that answered was familiar, deep, careful, measured, the same voice I'd heard on the recording, the same voice that had threatened her, the same voice that had probably been the last thing she heard. I told them I needed to see them, that I'd found something important, something they needed to know about. I heard hesitation in their voice, calculation, the sound of someone trying to figure out how much I knew and how dangerous I'd become. We arranged to meet, a public place, safe, neutral, the kind of location where nothing bad could happen, where two people could have a conversation without anyone getting hurt. But I knew it was a lie, just like I knew the truth about what had happened to her, just like I knew what was probably going to happen to me. The voice on the monitor had given me all the answers I'd been looking for, but it had also given me something else, something I wasn't sure I wanted. It had given me a choice between safety and justice, between silence and truth, between letting her killer go free and risking everything to make sure someone paid for what they'd done. I hung up the phone and looked at the monitor one last time, still silent, still innocent, still holding secrets that could destroy lives and solve mysteries and change everything about what people thought they knew. The red light blinked once, a final message, a goodbye, a reminder that some truths are too dangerous to speak out loud, and some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. I unplugged the monitor and put it back in the storage closet, but I kept the recordings, all of them, hidden where no one would think to look, insurance against the future, evidence for someone who might be braver than I was, or luckier, or more willing to risk everything for the truth. Because that's what the voice had really been trying to tell me, not just who killed her, but why, and what they were willing to do to keep that secret safe, and what would happen to anyone who got too close to the truth. The meeting was tomorrow. I would go, I would listen, I would pretend I didn't know what I knew, and maybe, if I was very careful and very lucky, I would find a way to make sure justice was served without becoming the next victim. But probably not, because the voice on the monitor had taught me something else, something about the nature of secrets and the people who kill to keep them. They don't stop at one. They don't suddenly develop a conscience. They don't decide that enough is enough. They keep going, keep killing, keep protecting their secrets until someone stops them or until they make a mistake that finally brings them down. I hoped I wouldn't be the next mistake, but I was pretty sure I would be. Crime 7, I came home to silence. Everything was just how I'd left it, keys on the counter, shoes by the door, curtains drawn, but the bathroom was different. The door was wide open, steam clung to the ceiling, and the bathtub, the one I hadn't touched in weeks, was filled to the edge with water, clear, still, not a ripple on the surface. There were no wet footprints, no trail of water, nothing to explain how it filled. I stood there staring at my own reflection in the water until it blinked. That was the moment I knew something was wrong, not with the water, not with the house, but with my memory. The reflection wasn't mine. The face looking back had different eyes, a different mouth, a face I recognized but couldn't place. I drained the tub. The water spiraled down with a sound like whispered secrets. When I turned the faucet off, my hands were shaking. I couldn't explain why. The next day I called my landlord. He was surprised to hear from me, said I hadn't been late on rent in months, asked if everything was okay. I told him about the bathtub, about the water. He paused for a long time before speaking. "Are you sure you didn't fill it yourself?" I was sure, almost sure, but doubt crept in like cold water through cracks in concrete. That evening I found the first photograph. It was tucked inside a book I'd been reading, a crime novel about memory and deception. The photo showed a woman standing in a bathroom, her back to the camera. She was wearing my bathrobe, the same bathroom where I'd found the filled tub. I didn't recognize her, but something about her posture felt familiar. The way she held her shoulders, the tilt of her head, like looking at yourself in a funhouse mirror. I searched every book on my shelf, found 17 more photographs, all different women, all in the same bathroom, all wearing my clothes. Their faces were always turned away or obscured by shadow, but their bodies told stories I couldn't read. The woman in the third photograph had a scar on her left arm. I rolled up my sleeve. The same scar was there, faded but unmistakable. I started keeping a journal, recording every detail I could remember about each day. What I ate, where I went, who I spoke to. The entries became obsessive, pages filled with minute observations about the mundane moments that make up a life. But there were gaps, whole afternoons missing, days where I'd written nothing, as if I'd simply ceased to exist for hours at a time. The photographs kept appearing, in my coat pocket, between the pages of magazines, taped to the inside of my medicine cabinet. Each one showed the same bathroom from different angles, always with a woman who looked almost like me, but wasn't quite right. I installed a camera in the bathroom, a small device that recorded continuously, storing footage on a memory card I checked every morning. For 3 weeks it showed nothing unusual, me brushing my teeth, washing my face, the ordinary rituals of daily life. Then I found the footage from last Tuesday. The camera had been moved. Instead of pointing at the sink, it faced the bathtub. The timestamp showed 4 hours of recording, but the video was only 12 minutes long. In those 12 minutes, I watched myself fill the bathtub, but it wasn't me. The woman in the video moved differently, held her body in ways that felt foreign. She tested the water temperature with her fingers, adjusted the faucet with practiced precision. When she turned toward the camera, her face was calm, almost serene. I had no memory of any of it. The woman in the video looked directly at the camera before leaving the bathroom. Her eyes were my eyes, but they held knowledge I didn't possess. She knew she was being watched. She knew I would find this footage. I took the memory card to a specialist who worked with surveillance systems. He was quiet as he examined the file, running it through different software programs. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "This has been edited professionally. Someone with serious technical skills cut out most of the original footage." I asked him what might have been removed. He shrugged, but his expression suggested he had theories he wasn't sharing. Could be anything, could be nothing, but whoever did this wanted you to see exactly what you saw, nothing more. I started researching memory disorders, dissociative conditions, anything that might explain the missing time. The internet offered dozens of possibilities, each more frightening than the last, but none of them explained the photographs, the edited video, the deliberate nature of what was happening. That's when I found the rental agreement, not the one I'd signed, but another one. Same apartment, same address, but with a different name. A woman's name I didn't recognize. The lease had been active for 6 months before mine began. I contacted the previous tenant through an old email address listed in the building's records. She responded immediately, as if she'd been waiting for my message. "I wondered when you'd find out," she wrote. "We need to talk." We met at a coffee shop several blocks from the apartment. She was younger than I'd expected, with nervous hands and eyes that never quite met mine. When she spoke, her voice was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. "You don't remember me," she said. It wasn't a question. I told her I didn't. She nodded as if this was expected. "You lived there before me, before your current lease. You lived there for almost a year." She was lying. I would have remembered. I kept meticulous records of my addresses, my leases, my life. There was no gap in my personal history that could accommodate another year in the same apartment. But she had proof. Photographs of mail with my name on it, dated from the year I claimed not to remember. Utility bills in my name. A security deposit receipt with my signature. "You had some kind of breakdown," she said. "Started filling the bathtub every night. Never used it, just filled it with water and left it there. The landlord found you one morning, sitting on the bathroom floor, staring at the water." I asked her what happened next. She looked uncomfortable, glanced around the coffee shop as if checking for listeners. "You were taken somewhere for treatment. When you came back, you didn't remember living there. The landlord let you sign a new lease, thought maybe a fresh start would help." I pressed her for details about the treatment, the breakdown, the missing year. She claimed not to know specifics, but her evasiveness felt rehearsed. She was telling me exactly what someone had coached her to say. "Why the photographs?" I asked. She seemed genuinely confused. "What photographs?" I described them, the women in my bathroom, the turned-away faces, the familiar unfamiliarity of their postures. As I spoke, her expression shifted from confusion to something approaching fear. "That's not possible," she said. "I cleared out everything when I moved. There were no photographs." But she was lying again. I could see it in the way she held her coffee cup, the careful steadiness of her voice. She knew about the photographs. She might have even taken them. I returned to the apartment with more questions than answers. The place felt different now, charged with the weight of forgotten history. I examined every surface, every corner, looking for evidence of the year I couldn't remember. In the back of the bedroom closet, behind a loose board, I found a box. Inside were medical records, appointment cards, prescription bottles with my name on them. The medications were for memory disorders, anxiety, dissociative episodes. The prescriptions were recent, current, ongoing. I'd been taking these medications for months without knowing it. Someone had been dissolving them in my food, my drinks, my daily routine. The dosages were carefully calculated to maintain a specific level of confusion, just enough to keep me functioning while erasing crucial memories. The medical records painted a picture of systematic psychological manipulation, not treatment, but something else. something designed to keep me in a state of controlled amnesia. I stopped eating anything I hadn't prepared myself, stopped drinking tap water. The fog in my mind began to lift, but with clarity came terror. The gaps in my memory weren't natural. They were deliberate, maintained, necessary for something I was only beginning to understand. The photographs weren't random. They were documentation, evidence of different versions of myself, different personalities cultivated and recorded. Each woman in the pictures was me, but altered, medicated, trained to behave in specific ways. I was part of an experiment or a treatment or something worse. The bathtub was never about water. It was about submission, about testing how much I would accept without question. Each time I found it full, each time I drained it without understanding why, I was proving my compliance. But the reflection that blinked back at me wasn't mine. It belonged to another version of myself, one who understood the game being played, one who was trying to warn me. I sit here now writing this, knowing that tomorrow I might not remember any of it. The medication is still in my system, still clouding my thoughts. I've hidden this account where I hope to find it again, but I'm not sure I'll know to look. The person who lived here before me wasn't a different tenant. She was me, in a different state of mind, under a different treatment protocol. And the person who will live here after me will also be me, reset again, ready for the next phase of whatever they're doing. I understand now why the bathtub was always full. It wasn't about the water, it was about the reflection, about showing me glimpses of who I really am underneath the medication and the manipulation. The woman in the water who blinked back at me was the only version of myself still fighting to remember, still trying to break through the carefully constructed amnesia that keeps me trapped in this cycle. I don't know who they are or why they're doing this, but I know I'm not the first and I won't be the last. The photographs will continue to appear, documenting each new iteration of my manufactured identity. The bathtub will keep filling itself, and I'll keep draining it, never quite understanding why. Until one day, maybe, I'll remember enough to stop playing their game. Until then, I'll keep writing these warnings to myself, hoping that someday I'll be ready to listen. Crime 8, I began finding the notes tucked into strange places, under the fridge, behind the toilet tank, inside a sealed box of cereal. Always handwritten, always short. They didn't make sense to anyone else, but they did to me. They referenced things I'd done, regrets I hadn't spoken, private moments I never shared. No one else in the house believed me. They called it stress. Said I was writing them myself, but the handwriting didn't match mine. And lately the messages have changed. They're not just observations now, they're instructions. And I'm starting to follow them. The first instruction was simple: check the basement storage room behind the water heater. I found myself walking down those concrete steps, flashlight in hand, even though I hadn't planned to. The beam cut through dusty air that smelled of mildew and something else, something sweet and chemical that made my throat tighten. Behind the water heater, wedged between the wall and the metal tank, was a manila envelope. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free. Inside were photographs, not family photos or vacation snapshots. These were surveillance pictures taken from a distance. People going about their daily lives unaware they were being watched. Some faces I recognized from the neighborhood, others were strangers. But in the bottom corner of each photo was a small red X marked in pen. I carried the envelope upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. The kitchen felt different now, as if the familiar space had shifted somehow. I spread the photos across the dining table, studying each face marked with that crimson X. The handwriting on the back of each picture was the same as the notes, that careful, measured script that definitely wasn't mine. My wife found me there an hour later, photos scattered like tarot cards across the wooden surface. She gathered them quickly, her movements sharp and efficient. "Where did you get these?" she asked, but her voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "The basement," I said. There was a note telling me to look there. She was quiet for a long moment, holding the photos against her chest. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen. "You need to stop this. Whatever game you're playing, it needs to stop." But I wasn't playing a game, I was certain of that. The next note appeared the following morning, tucked inside my coffee mug. The paper was slightly damp, which meant someone had placed it there after I'd washed the dishes but before I'd made my coffee. The window of opportunity was narrow, perhaps 30 minutes while I'd showered. "Visit the old woman on the corner house. Ask her about the missing dog." I knew the house it meant. Blue shutters, overgrown garden, a porch that sagged under the weight of neglect. The woman who lived there rarely came outside, but I'd seen her watching from her window, a pale figure behind lace curtains. She answered the door before I could knock, as if she'd been waiting. Her eyes were sharp despite her age, and when she smiled, her teeth were too white to be natural. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The living room smelled of lavender and something underneath it, something organic and unpleasant. She gestured for me to sit on a floral couch that felt damp beneath my legs. "You're asking about the dog," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "The same way you knew to come here." She settled into a chair across from me, her movements deliberate and careful. "Someone's been leaving you messages, haven't they?" My mouth went dry. "You know about the notes." "I know about a lot of things." She leaned forward, her pale eyes fixed on mine. "The dog didn't go missing, it was taken, and the person who took it has been very busy since then." She stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with that same careful handwriting, but the entries went back months, maybe years. She turned to a page near the middle and read aloud. "The subject shows increasing compliance with written instructions. Previous resistance has diminished, ready for next phase." "What is this?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "An experiment," she said simply, "to see how far someone can be pushed through carefully planted suggestions, how completely a person can be controlled without them realizing it." The journal trembled in her hands as she continued reading. Phase 1, establish pattern of mysterious communication. Phase 2, introduce elements of paranoia and isolation. Phase 3, direct action through specific instructions. I stood up too quickly, the room spinning around me. "This isn't real, this is." "Look at your hands," she interrupted. I looked down. My fingers were stained with something dark and reddish brown. I couldn't remember touching anything that would leave such marks. But as I stared at them, fragments of memory began to surface. Digging in the backyard, the smell of damp earth, the weight of something heavy wrapped in plastic. "The dog was just the beginning," the old woman continued. "A test to see if you would follow through, to see if you could be made to do things you would never normally do." I backed toward the door, but she moved surprisingly fast for someone her age, positioning herself between me and the exit. "The notes will continue," she said, "and you'll continue to follow them, because now you know the truth, and that knowledge changes everything." "What truth?" "That you're capable of things you never thought possible. that the line between normal and monstrous is thinner than you imagined, that with the right pressure applied gradually, anyone can become someone else entirely. I pushed past her and ran, but her words followed me down the street. Back home, I went straight to the basement, searching for more evidence of what I'd apparently done. The smell was stronger now, that sweet chemical scent mixed with something earthier. I found the source behind a stack of storage boxes, a plastic tarp that had been disturbed recently. I didn't unwrap it, I couldn't, but I knew what I would find inside. The next note was waiting on my pillow that night. My wife slept beside me, breathing steadily, but I wondered if she was really asleep or just pretending. The message was longer this time, more detailed. It described exactly what I would do next, step by step, as if I were following a recipe. And despite everything I'd learned, despite the horror of what I'd apparently already done, I found myself memorizing the instructions. My body seemed to move independently of my will, already preparing for what came next. The old woman had been right, the notes would continue, and I would follow them. Because the most terrifying part wasn't that someone was controlling me, it was that I was beginning to enjoy it, the freedom of not having to make choices, of letting someone else decide what I should do, the relief of surrendering responsibility for my actions. I folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others. Tomorrow, I would follow the new instructions. I would do what the handwriting told me to do. And I would tell myself, as I had been telling myself all along, that I had no choice. But deep down, in a place I rarely examined, I knew the truth. I did have a choice. I'd had one all along. I was simply choosing not to make it. The handwriting wasn't controlling me. It was just showing me who I really was underneath all the pretense of civilization, who I'd always been, waiting for permission to emerge. And now I had that permission, written in careful script and tucked into the corners of my ordinary life. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the person who had first found those notes. I was whoever the handwriting needed me to be. And somewhere in the house, in a place I hadn't looked yet, I knew there was another note waiting, another instruction, another step deeper into the person I was becoming. I could hardly wait to find it. Crime 9, I've lived here long enough to know the feel of these stairs underfoot, 12 steps from bottom to top. Always 12, but last night I counted 13. The new step wasn't visible, it was just there, a pause in the climb. My foot fell on something solid where there should have been air. I reached down, expecting to feel the carpeted surface, but it felt cold, wet, almost breathing. I kept climbing, hoping it was my imagination. But today, when I looked down the stairwell, there were only 11. One of them is hiding, one of them isn't mine. The first thing I did was check the records, property documents, architectural plans, anything that might explain why my perception of these stairs had shifted so dramatically. The building inspector who came by after the incident seemed puzzled. He measured each step twice, running his tape measure along the worn edges where countless feet had passed. Regulation height, he said, his voice echoing in the narrow stairwell. Nothing unusual here. But I knew what I had felt. That step had been different, not just in height or texture, but in presence, like stepping on someone's back while they held their breath. The woman who lived here before me had left behind a box of photographs in the basement storage room. I hadn't touched it for months, but now I found myself sorting through faded images of the same staircase, taken from different angles and apparently different decades. In one photo, dated on the back, there were definitely 12 steps. In another, from just a few years later, I could swear I counted 13. I started keeping a journal. Every trip up and down, I recorded the count. The numbers varied, sometimes 11, sometimes 12, occasionally 13. Never more, never less than those three possibilities. The pattern seemed random until I noticed something else. The count always changed after I'd been away from the house for more than a few hours. My neighbor, an elderly man who had lived next door for 30 years, mentioned something interesting when I asked him about the building's history. There had been an incident, he said, back when the previous tenant lived here. A fall down the stairs. The ambulance had come, but they'd taken their time getting the stretcher up. Strange, he thought, since it was such a narrow stairwell. "Did they ever find out what happened?" I asked. He looked at me strangely. "Find out what happened. She fell. That's what happens when you miss a step." But which step had she missed? And why did I feel like I was walking on borrowed ground every time I climbed to my bedroom? I began researching the woman who had lived here before me. Public records revealed her name, her age, her profession as a freelance graphic designer. She had lived alone, worked from home, rarely had visitors according to the postal worker who still delivered mail to this address. Her death certificate listed the cause as trauma from a fall, but the police report was more detailed. The responding officer noted something unusual. The woman's body had been found at the bottom of the stairs, but her injuries suggested she had fallen from a greater height than the staircase would typically allow. The medical examiner had questioned this discrepancy, but ultimately ruled it an accident. Sometimes, the report concluded, people fall harder than the physics would suggest. I found her laptop in the basement, forgotten among the cleaning supplies. The password was still saved on the browser, and I spent hours scrolling through her digital life. Email exchanges with clients, grocery lists, photos of cats she'd apparently fed in the alley behind the building. Normal, mundane, alive. But buried in her photo library, I found a series of images that made my skin crawl. Pictures of the staircase taken from the same angle on different days. In each photo, she had drawn a small mark on the wall beside each step, counting them, documenting them. The marks progressed up the wall in neat rows, but the number changed from photo to photo. In the last photo, dated just a week before her death, she had written in red ink beside the final mark, "It's not my step." I started sleeping downstairs. Every night I would hear sounds from the stairwell, not footsteps exactly, but something like breathing wood, a settling that seemed too purposeful to be natural. Sometimes I would wake up and find wet spots on the carpet where I had felt that strange step, but by morning they were always dry. The breakthrough came when I found her journal, hidden behind a loose baseboard in the upstairs bedroom. Her handwriting was meticulous, documenting the same phenomenon I was experiencing, but her observations went deeper. She had traced the building's history back to its construction, interviewed previous tenants, even spoken with the original architect's son. According to her research, the building had been designed with 12 steps, built with 12 steps, inspected and approved with 12 steps. But according to her interviews, every tenant who had lived here for more than 6 months had eventually reported the same experience. Steps that appeared and disappeared, counts that changed, the feeling of walking on something that wasn't quite their own. One entry near the end of her journal stood out. "I think I know whose step it is. The construction worker who fell during the building's construction. His name was removed from the official records, but I found his family. They said he was found at the bottom of the stairwell, but his injuries suggested a fall from the second floor. The same injury pattern the medical examiner noted in my case studies of other tenants who had fallen here." She had been investigating her own future death. The final entry was dated the day before she died. I understand now. It's not that the step appears and disappears. It's that sometimes I'm walking on the stairs as they exist now, and sometimes I'm walking on the stairs as they existed then. When someone was falling, when someone was dying, when the wood was absorbing something it was never meant to hold. I closed the journal and looked at the staircase, 12 steps. I could see them clearly, count them easily. But I knew that later, when I wasn't looking directly at them, when I was just living my life and climbing to my bedroom, there would be a different number. And I knew that someday I would feel that 13th step again, the one that wasn't mine, the one that belonged to someone who had fallen before me and someone who would fall after me. I've started looking at rental listings. Not because I'm afraid of falling, but because I'm afraid of what might happen if I stay long enough to become part of the stairs myself. To become the step that someone else feels under their feet, cold and wet and breathing. The building inspector came by again last week. I hadn't called him. He said he'd received a complaint about irregular stair heights, but when he measured them, everything was within code. 12 steps, regulation height, nothing unusual. But as he packed up his equipment, he paused at the bottom of the staircase and looked up. "You know," he said, "I could have sworn I counted 13 when I first walked up here." I didn't tell him that I had counted 11. The photographs in the basement show 12 steps. The journal documents 13. The building inspector measured 12. I feel 13 and count 11. Which number is real? Which staircase am I actually climbing? And whose step will I become when I finally miss the one that isn't mine? I've lived here long enough to know the feel of these stairs underfoot, but I'm beginning to understand that I've never really known these stairs at all. They've been walking on me as much as I've been walking on them. One of them is hiding, one of them isn't mine. And I'm starting to suspect that one of them might be me. Crime 10, I never noticed the nails until I tried to open the window for the first time since moving in. They weren't old either. Clean metal, driven in at an angle, almost careful, from the outside. I walked around the house trying to make sense of it. All the other windows opened fine, but that one overlooking the empty stretch of woods behind the property was sealed shut like someone had wanted to keep something out, or in. There were marks in the frame, 2 long arched scrapes in the wood, not made by tools, something rougher, more desperate. I painted over them that night. But the next morning the window was open half an inch, and the nails were gone. I called the previous owner. She didn't answer. I left a message, then another. Her voice on the recording sounded tired, strained, like she'd been expecting bad news. The real estate agent who sold me the house seemed nervous when I mentioned the window. She kept adjusting her collar, her fingers drumming against her clipboard. The previous owner was very particular about security, she said. Some people are just careful. But careful people don't nail windows shut from the outside. They install locks, alarms, bars. They don't leave scratch marks that look like someone was trying to claw their way out. I started checking the window every night. Sometimes it was closed. Sometimes it was open just enough to let in the smell of pine and something else, something metallic and cold. I'd close it, but by morning it would be open again. The paint around the frame kept flaking off, revealing more scratches underneath. The neighbor who lived closest to the woods finally called me back. I'd left my number with several people, asking about the house's history. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She had a son, she said, troubled boy, always getting into fights, causing problems. He disappeared one winter, just vanished. Police searched everywhere, but they never found him. I asked about the window. There was a long pause. She said he used to climb out that window at night, sneak into the woods. She tried everything to keep him inside, locks, alarms, even boarding it up, but he always found a way. Smart kid, she said, too smart for his own good. The call ended abruptly. When I tried calling back, the number was disconnected. I went to the local police station. The officer at the desk was young, eager to help. He pulled up the missing person report on his computer, his face growing serious as he read. The boy was reported missing during a particularly harsh winter, he said. Mother claimed he'd been acting strange for weeks before he disappeared, paranoid, aggressive. She found evidence he'd been living in the woods part-time, makeshift shelter, supplies, but when the search teams went out, there was nothing. I asked about the window specifically. The officer scrolled through the report. Says here the mother mentioned the boy had been nailing the window shut from the outside, claimed someone was trying to get in. She thought it was just another one of his paranoid episodes. But the boy had been nailing it shut from the outside, which meant he'd been outside when he did it, which meant he'd been trying to keep something inside. I drove back to the house with a new understanding. The scratches weren't from someone trying to get out, they were from someone trying to get in, and the boy had been trying to keep them from succeeding. That night I positioned myself in the bedroom, watching the window. The woods were silent, but there was a heaviness in the air that made my skin crawl. I could smell that metallic scent again, stronger now. Around midnight I heard it, a soft scraping sound like fingernails on glass. The window was still closed, but something was moving outside. I crept closer, my heart pounding. Through the glass I could see shapes moving between the trees. At first I thought it was just shadows, but they were too deliberate, too purposeful. They moved like people, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that didn't look natural. I reached for the window latch, then stopped. The boy had nailed it shut from the outside. He'd been trying to keep something in the woods where it belonged. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. The scratching sound grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was out there knew I was watching. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, as far from the window as possible. When dawn came, I checked the window again. It was open several inches, and there were new scratch marks in the frame, fresh ones. And on the windowsill there was something I hadn't noticed before, a small pile of what looked like fingernail clippings. But they were too long, too sharp, and they were still warm. I called the police again, but the same officer who'd helped me before claimed he had no record of our conversation. No missing person report, no boy who disappeared. When I pressed him, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "I've been working this desk for 5 years," he said. "I think I'd remember a missing child case." I went back to the neighbor who'd told me about the boy. Her house was empty, windows boarded up. The mailbox was rusted shut. A neighbor from across the street said no one had lived there for years. I was losing my grip on what was real, but the window kept opening, the scratches kept appearing, and every night the shapes in the woods grew bolder, coming closer to the house. I started researching the property's history online. Public records, newspaper archives, anything that might explain what was happening, but every search came up empty. No missing child, no troubled family, no history of violence or tragedy. It was as if the boy had never existed at all. But someone had nailed that window shut. Someone had left those scratches. Someone had been trying to keep something contained. I found myself checking the window obsessively, multiple times per night. Sometimes it was closed, sometimes open. Sometimes there were new scratches, sometimes the old ones seemed to have healed. The metallic smell was getting stronger, and now I could taste it in my mouth, copper and salt, and something else I couldn't identify. One night I decided to test my theory. I took a hammer and a handful of nails and went outside. The woods were silent, but I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I positioned the nails against the window frame, angling them the same way the original ones had been placed. As I raised the hammer, I heard a sound from inside the house. A voice, muffled but urgent. It sounded like someone calling for help. I dropped the hammer and ran back inside. The house was empty, but the voice continued. It was coming from the walls themselves, from the very structure of the house. A young voice, desperate and afraid. "Don't let them in," it whispered. "Please don't let them in." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice was clearer now, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the space between them, from somewhere inside the house where someone shouldn't be able to fit. I went back to the window. It was wide open now, and the shapes in the woods had moved closer. They were at the edge of the tree line, just visible in the moonlight. I could see their faces now, or what passed for faces. They were wrong, like someone had described human features to someone who'd never seen them. The voice spoke again, more urgent now. "They're coming. You have to nail it shut from the outside. It's the only way." I understood then. The boy hadn't disappeared. He'd never left. He was still here, trapped between worlds, trying to protect whoever came after him. The window wasn't just a window, it was a barrier, a seal that kept something much worse from getting through. I grabbed the hammer and nails and ran outside. The shapes were moving toward the house now, their movements becoming more fluid, more human-like as they approached. I could hear them making sounds, not quite words, but something that might have been language once. I hammered the nails into the window frame, working as fast as I could. The shapes were almost to the house now, their faces becoming clearer. They looked like people I might have known once, but stretched and distorted, like reflections in broken glass. The last nail went in just as the first shape reached the window. It pressed against the glass, its face contorting with rage. The other shapes joined it, clawing at the window, their movements becoming frantic. But the window held, the nails held, and slowly, reluctantly, the shapes began to retreat back into the woods. I stood outside for a long time, watching them disappear into the darkness. The metallic smell was fading, and the oppressive feeling in the air was lifting. From inside the house, I could hear the boy's voice one last time, fainter now, but filled with relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "Now they can't get in." I moved out the next week. The real estate agent was the same woman who'd sold me the house, but she didn't seem to remember me. She listed the property without any mention of the window or its history. I watched from across the street as the next family moved in, a young couple with 2 small children. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to tell them about the window, about the nails, about the boy who was still trying to protect them. But I knew they wouldn't believe me, the same way I wouldn't have believed it if someone had told me. Instead, I left a note tucked under their door, just a simple message. The window in the back bedroom needs to stay nailed shut. From the outside, trust me. I drove away that night, but I still think about that house, about the boy who gave up his freedom to keep something worse from escaping, about the shapes in the woods that might still be waiting for someone to make a mistake. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I really did nail the window shut tight enough. If the boy is still there, still protecting whoever comes next, or if someday someone will try to open that window again, not knowing what they're letting in. The scratches were deeper than I thought, and some barriers once broken can never be completely repaired. Crime 11, it was a whisper, barely audible, like someone muttering behind the walls. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just background noise, maybe plumbing, but it only happened when I passed the hallway closet. I stood in front of it one night, lights off, listening. A breath, a phrase I didn't understand. My skin prickled as I lined in. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from inside that narrow space behind the coats. I opened the door, nothing, but the whispering stopped. Now I leave the closet open, and every morning I find it shut again. Sometimes with the latch locked from the inside. The first person I told was my neighbor, the one who lived here before me. She listened carefully, nodding in a way that suggested she knew something I didn't. Her fingers drummed against her coffee cup as she spoke. She mentioned the previous tenant, a woman who kept to herself, who disappeared one winter without saying goodbye to anyone. I pressed for details. The neighbor's eyes shifted toward the window, then back to me. She said the woman used to complain about voices in the walls. Maintenance came several times, checked the pipes, the electrical work. They found nothing wrong. The woman became increasingly agitated, talking about someone hiding in her apartment, someone who wouldn't leave. The building manager confirmed the story when I approached him. He remembered the complaints, the repair requests, the way the woman's voice changed over the months. She became paranoid, he said, always insisting someone was listening to her conversations. The last maintenance report mentioned scratches on the inside of the closet door, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. I went back to examine the closet more carefully. The scratches were still there, faint but visible in the right light. They formed patterns, almost like letters, but distorted enough to be unclear. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough texture of wood damaged by something sharp, something desperate. The whispers returned that night, more distinct this time. I could make out fragments of words, pieces of sentences that seemed to respond to my presence. When I moved closer, the voice grew quieter, as if aware of being observed. When I stepped away, it resumed its urgent muttering. I started recording. The playback revealed nothing but static and my own breathing. But in the moment, standing in that hallway, the voice was unmistakable. It spoke in a cadence that felt familiar, using inflections that reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. The building's rental history showed 3 tenants in the past decade. Each had left unexpectedly, without completing their lease agreements. The first 2 had made similar complaints about disturbances, about feeling watched, about voices they couldn't locate. The pattern was consistent, documented in maintenance logs and complaint forms filed with the building management. I spoke to the maintenance worker who had responded to most of the calls. He was reluctant to discuss the details, but eventually admitted that each tenant had focused on the same closet. They all reported the same phenomena: whispers, locked doors, the sense of someone hiding just out of sight. He mentioned finding something during the last inspection, after the most recent tenant disappeared. Behind a loose panel in the back wall of the closet, there was a small opening that led to a space between the walls. The opening was just large enough for someone to squeeze through, connecting to a hidden area that ran alongside the apartment's layout. The space wasn't on any building plans. It seemed to be an architectural oversight, a gap created during construction that had gone unnoticed for years. Inside, he found evidence of habitation: food wrappers, empty bottles, makeshift bedding. Someone had been living there, moving through the walls, listening to the daily routines of the tenants. I examined the panel myself, pulling it away to reveal the narrow opening. The smell hit me immediately, stale air mixed with something organic, something that had been trapped for too long. I shined a flashlight into the space, seeing the cramped area where someone had carved out a hidden existence. The belongings were still there, arranged with careful precision. Personal items that didn't belong to any of the previous tenants. Photographs of people I didn't recognize, documents with names that meant nothing to me. But among them I found something that made my hands shake, a journal filled with detailed observations about the daily habits of each tenant who had lived in the apartment. The handwriting was meticulous, recording conversations overheard through the walls, routines observed through careful listening. Each entry was dated, creating a timeline of surveillance that spanned years. The most recent entries were about me, my schedule, my preferences, the way I moved through the apartment. The journal revealed a pattern of escalation. The hidden occupant had grown bolder with each tenant, moving from passive observation to active interference. Doors left open, items moved, sounds created to generate fear and confusion. The goal seemed to be driving each tenant away, reclaiming the apartment for exclusive use. But the most disturbing discovery was in the final entries. The handwriting changed, becoming more erratic, more desperate. The observer had become obsessed with the last tenant, the woman who had disappeared. The entries described a growing desire for direct contact, for moving beyond the walls and into the living space itself. I found her belongings in the deeper recesses of the hidden area. Personal items, clothing, identification documents. She hadn't disappeared voluntarily. She had been kept there in that cramped space by someone who had convinced themselves they were entitled to her presence, her apartment, her life. The revelation created a new terror. The whispering continued, but now I understood its source. Someone was still in those walls, still watching, still waiting. The previous tenant might still be there, or someone else had taken their place. The pattern was designed to repeat, to claim each new occupant through fear and manipulation. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I moved to the living room where I could watch the closet, where I could hear any movement. But the whispers adapted, coming from different walls, different locations. The hidden occupant was mobile, moving through a network of spaces I couldn't fully map. The police were skeptical when I reported the discovery. They examined the hidden area, took photographs, collected the belongings, but without a clear crime scene, without a body, they treated it as a missing person case that had gone cold. The investigation stalled, leaving me alone with the knowledge of what was happening. I tried to seal the opening, to block access to the hidden spaces, but the whispers found new routes, new ways to penetrate the apartment's defenses. The pattern was too established, too ingrained in the building's structure. Whoever was in those walls had spent years learning every pathway, every weakness. The building manager offered to let me break the lease, to move to a different unit, but I realized the problem wasn't limited to my apartment. The hidden spaces connected to other units, other closets, other lives. Moving wouldn't solve the problem, it would just transfer it to someone else. I still hear the whispers, they're more persistent now, more confident. Sometimes I find evidence of movement in the apartment, objects shifted, doors opened, signs that someone has been there while I was away. The hidden occupant is growing bolder, preparing for the next phase of their pattern. The closet door closes itself every night, locking from the inside, but I've learned not to open it anymore, because now I know that the whispers aren't coming from inside the closet. They're coming from someone who has been watching me, learning my routines, preparing to make their presence known. And every morning when I find the door closed again, I hear something new in the whispers. They're not just observing anymore, they're planning, and I'm not sure how much longer I can pretend I don't understand what they're saying. Crime 12, the floor in the laundry room had always dipped slightly in one corner. I thought it was just the house settling until the dog refused to go near it. He'd growl, low and steady, hackles raised. Curious, I lifted the boards. The smell hit me first, damp soil, rot, something older. Beneath the beams, the dirt had clearly been disturbed. There were fragments of something hard, porcelain maybe, or bone. I covered it all back up, tried to forget. But now they're scratching at night, from beneath the floorboards, always from that same corner. I should have left it alone. That's what I keep telling myself as I stare at the ceiling, listening to the faint scraping sounds that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The house had been vacant for months before I moved in. The previous owner, an elderly woman with silver hair and trembling hands, had left suddenly. The realtor mentioned something about a family emergency, but her eyes avoided mine when she said it. The scratching stops just before dawn. It always does. I bought this place because the price was right, because the neighborhood was quiet, because I needed a fresh start after everything that happened. The paperwork was straightforward, the inspection routine. Nobody mentioned the smell in the laundry room, the way the floorboards sagged in that particular corner, the way the dog next door would whine whenever it passed by the window. My first week here, I convinced myself it was mice. Old houses have mice. The scratching was just small claws on wood, nothing more. I set traps, checked for droppings, sealed every crack I could find. The traps remained empty. The scratching continued. That's when I decided to investigate properly. The boards came up easier than they should have. Someone had removed them before recently. The nails were loose, the wood scarred with pry marks. Beneath, the earth was soft, darker than the surrounding soil. My fingers found the fragments almost immediately, smooth pieces that caught the flashlight beam, reflecting it back like broken mirrors. I pulled one out, brushed off the dirt, definitely porcelain, part of a dish maybe, or a cup. The edge was jagged, sharp enough to cut. There were more pieces scattered throughout the disturbed soil, some larger, some no bigger than fingernails. As I dug deeper, my hand closed around something that made my blood freeze. A tooth, human by the look of it, a molar, the roots still intact. I should have called someone then, should have backed away, replaced the boards, picked up the phone. Instead, I kept digging. My rational mind cataloged every detail, the way the soil changed color deeper down, the strange fibrous material mixed with the dirt, the metallic smell that grew stronger with each handful of earth I removed. More teeth, a wedding ring, tarnished silver with a small diamond, fragments of fabric, once white, now the color of old blood, and bones, definitely bones. I sat back on my heels, flashlight trembling in my grip. The previous owner's face floated through my memory, those watery blue eyes, the way she'd clutched her purse during the walkthrough, how she'd avoided the laundry room entirely. She'd mentioned her late husband several times, how he'd loved the garden, how he'd spent hours working in the basement. The real estate agent had been eager to close quickly. Cash deal, no questions asked. The woman just wanted out, she'd said. Couldn't bear to stay in the house where they'd been so happy together. I covered everything back up, but sleep became impossible. Every sound made me jump, the refrigerator humming, the house settling, the scratching that seemed to come from the walls themselves now, not just the floor. I started researching property records, obituaries, police reports. The previous owner had lived here for 40 years. Her husband had died 5 years ago officially. Heart attack according to the death certificate, but there was no funeral announcement, no grave marker I could find. Friends and neighbors remembered him being sick, getting worse, then suddenly he was gone. Gone. I interviewed the postal worker who delivered mail to the house. He remembered the husband well, a large man with calloused hands who always worked in the garden, but he couldn't recall seeing him during his final months. The mail had piled up, bills went unpaid, until suddenly the woman was handling everything herself. The neighbor across the street, an elderly man with suspicious eyes, told me something that made my stomach clench. He'd heard arguing late at night, months before the husband's supposed death. Shouting, things breaking, then silence. The next morning, he'd seen the woman in her backyard, hosing down the basement steps. Thought maybe there'd been a flood, he said, but his expression suggested he'd thought something else entirely. I found the medical records through a contact who shouldn't have shown them to me. The husband had been admitted to the hospital multiple times in his final year. Falls, injuries, broken bones, the kind of pattern that raises questions, but the wife was always there, always with explanations. He was clumsy, she'd say. Accidents happen. The death certificate was signed by a doctor who'd retired immediately afterward, moved across the country, left no forwarding address. The funeral home that supposedly handled the arrangements had no record of the service. The crematorium never received a body. I went back to the crawl space. This time I dug systematically, carefully. The fragments told a story I didn't want to believe. Pieces of a dinner plate shattered, a coffee mug broken into sharp edges, kitchen items that had been used as weapons, then buried with their victim. The bones were wrapped in what had once been a bedsheet. The skull showed signs of repeated trauma. The ribs were cracked, some broken cleanly, others showing evidence of healing from previous injuries. This man had suffered for a long time before someone finally ended it. I found his wallet, leather cracked and stained. The driver's license was still readable. The photo showed a man with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. The kind of person who'd trust the wrong people, who'd stay too long in a bad situation, who'd make excuses for bruises and broken bones. The scratching stopped after I uncovered the truth. The house felt different, quieter, as if something had finally been acknowledged, finally been seen. I should have gone to the police then, should have presented the evidence, demanded justice. But the woman was gone, vanished as completely as her husband had been meant to. The house was mine now, legally purchased, papers signed. Her crime was my problem. I think about him sometimes, the man in the crawl space. Wonder what his last thoughts were if he knew what was coming. The medical records suggested he'd been getting stronger, fighting back. Maybe she'd grown tired of the hospital visits, the suspicious looks, the questions that were starting to be asked. Maybe she'd decided it was time to end it. The neighbors remember her as a devoted wife. She'd cared for him through his illness, they said. Such a tragedy when he finally passed. Such a relief for her after watching him suffer for so long. I reburied everything exactly as I'd found it, replaced the boards, sealed the gaps. The dog next door has stopped whining. The scratching has stopped. The house feels settled now, finally at peace. But I can't forget what I know. Can't pretend I didn't see the evidence, didn't piece together the truth. She's out there somewhere, living under a new name in a new place. Maybe she's found another lonely person to care for, another soul who trusts too easily. The police would need more than fragments and suspicions. They'd need proof, witnesses, a confession. They'd need someone willing to disturb the peace of a quiet neighborhood, to dig up old pain and buried secrets. I'm not that person. I bought this house for a fresh start, not to become part of someone else's tragedy. The man in the crawl space is beyond help now. Justice, if it comes, will have to find its own way. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear something that might be footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate, purposeful. The sound of someone who knows exactly where they're going and what they'll find when they get there. I tell myself it's just the house settling, just old wood and loose nails and the weight of secrets finally coming to rest. But I know better. Some things don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. Crime 13, I had hung the painting in the hallway myself, an abstract scene bought from a thrift store, muted colors and cracked canvas. It was ugly, really, but the frame was beautiful. One morning something was different. The shapes had shifted, subtly. A figure that hadn't been there before now stood in the background, just a silhouette. Over the next few days it moved closer. No one else believed me. I took a photo for proof, but in the picture the painting was blank, just brush strokes. Now I cover it with a towel, but every night the towel's on the floor. And the figure is closer to the edge. The painting came from an estate sale downtown. The seller was a woman with hollow eyes who barely looked at me when I handed her the $20. She kept glancing at the painting like it had personally offended her. I should have asked more questions. But I didn't. I never do. The frame was ornate, gold-leafed, probably worth more than everything else in my apartment combined. The painting itself was forgettable, swirls of brown and gray, maybe a landscape, maybe nothing at all. I hung it in the hallway because it fit the space perfectly, right between the bathroom door and the kitchen entrance. For weeks it was just there, background noise. I'd pass it dozens of times a day without really seeing it. That's how most things work in a life like mine. You stop noticing what's always been there. Until it wasn't always there. The first change was so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining it. A shadow in the upper right corner that seemed darker than before. A smudge of paint that looked almost like a face if you squinted. I stood in front of it for several minutes that morning, coffee growing cold in my hands, trying to remember if those details had always been there. Memory is unreliable, I know this. I work with enough police reports to understand how witnesses can swear they saw something that never happened or missed something that was right in front of them. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. I started paying attention. The next morning the shadow had definition, not much, just enough to suggest a human shape, a figure standing far in the background of whatever scene the original artist had intended. I took a step closer, then another. The brushstrokes were old, cracked with age, but this section looked fresh somehow, wet almost. I reached out to touch it and stopped myself. Something about the idea made my skin crawl. Instead, I called my sister. She's practical, logical, works in accounting. If anyone could talk sense into me, it would be her. Paintings don't change, she said after I explained. You're probably just noticing details you missed before, or maybe the lighting is different. But I knew the lighting. I'd lived in this apartment for 3 years. I knew how the morning sun hit the hallway, how the shadows fell in the evening. Nothing had changed except the painting. She came over that afternoon, stood in front of it for a long time, head tilted, arms crossed. Finally, she shrugged. I don't see any figure, she said, just abstract shapes. I looked again. The silhouette was there, clear as anything. Darker than the surrounding brushstrokes, positioned just off-center, facing toward the front of the canvas. Right there, I pointed, in the background. She followed my finger, squinted, shook her head. I think you're seeing things that aren't there. But they were there every day, clearer than before. I started documenting it, photos with my phone, measurements with a ruler, sketches in a notebook. The figure was moving, not dramatically, not like in a movie, but gradually, inevitably. Each morning it was slightly closer to the foreground, slightly more defined. The photos showed nothing, just the same abstract swirls, the same meaningless brushstrokes, but standing in front of the actual painting, I could see it perfectly. The figure was tall, thin, wearing what looked like a long coat, no face yet, but a definite human shape. I went back to the estate sale address. The house was empty, a for sale sign planted in the dying grass. I asked neighbors about the previous owner. Most didn't know anything, but an elderly man across the street remembered her. Kept to herself, he said. Lost her husband a few years back. Strange woman, always talking about things that weren't there. He paused, looked at me with curious eyes. You buy anything from her sale? I nodded. Might want to be careful. She claimed that house was haunted, but I think she was just lonely. Grief makes people see things. That night I covered the painting with a towel, heavy fabric tucked carefully around the frame. If the figure was going to move, I didn't want to watch. I woke up to the towel on the floor. The figure was closer now, much closer. I could make out details, buttons on the coat, the suggestion of hands, the way the shoulders were set. It was facing forward, looking directly out of the canvas, looking at me. I called the police, not because I thought they'd believe me, but because I needed to talk to someone official, someone who dealt with impossible things every day. The officer who came was young, patient. He listened to my story without laughing, took notes, examined the painting carefully. He saw the same abstract shapes everyone else saw, nothing more. Has anyone else been in your apartment recently? He asked. No one. I lived alone, worked from home, barely had visitors. Any history of hallucinations, medication changes, stress? I was stressed, but not in any unusual way. Life was routine, predictable, boring, nothing that would explain this. He left me a card and a gentle suggestion to see a doctor. I appreciated his kindness, but I knew what I was seeing. The figure wasn't a hallucination. It was real, present, part of the painting in a way that photographs couldn't capture. I decided to research the painting's history. Estate sales keep records, and I had the address. It took some digging, but I found the seller's name in the obituaries. She died 2 weeks after the sale. Natural causes, according to the brief notice. Her husband had died 3 years earlier, also natural causes, but the details were stranger. He'd been found in his study, slumped over his desk, surrounded by paintings he'd never shown anyone. The article mentioned that he'd been a talented but reclusive artist who'd stopped selling his work decades ago. I found his name in old gallery listings, tracked down a few of his earlier pieces. The style was familiar, the same abstract approach, the same muted colors, but there was something else in those older works, something that made my chest tighten. Figures, always figures, barely visible in the background, watching from the edges of the composition. I went back to the house. The for sale sign was gone, but the place was still empty. I walked around the perimeter, peering through windows, looking for any clue about what had happened there. The study was in the back, windows facing the yard. I could see easels, canvases stacked against the walls, paintbrushes scattered on a table, everything covered in dust, abandoned. That night I didn't cover the painting. I sat in the hallway, watching it directly, waiting for something to happen. The figure was almost at the front of the canvas now, detailed enough that I could see the expression on its face. It looked sad, tired, like it had been walking for a very long time and was finally close to wherever it was going. I fell asleep in the chair. When I woke, the painting was different again. The figure was gone. But there were wet footprints on the floor, leading from the painting toward my bedroom door. I followed them. They stopped at the foot of my bed where I'd been sleeping just hours before. The carpet was damp cold with the faint smell of turpentine and something else, something organic and unpleasant. I called my sister again. This time she came over immediately, brought her husband, insisted I pack a bag and stay with them for a few days. They were worried about me, about my mental state, about what they saw as an obvious breakdown. But before I left, I took one more look at the painting. The figure was back, standing in the background again, exactly where it had been on the first day, like nothing had happened. Like it was waiting. The police report about the husband's death mentioned something I'd missed before. He'd been working on a self-portrait when he died, but the canvas was blank when they found him. Not unfinished, blank, like whatever he'd been painting had simply vanished. I never went back to the apartment. My sister handled the move, packed my things, dealt with the lease. She threw away the painting, claimed it was water damaged and unsalvageable. I didn't argue. But sometimes in my new place, I catch myself looking at the walls differently, watching for shapes that shouldn't be there, shadows that move when no one's looking. I don't buy art anymore. I don't hang anything that might look back. Because I know now what the husband was trying to paint. I know what the figure was, why it moved, why it left those wet footprints on my floor. It wasn't trapped in the painting. It was traveling through it, using the canvas as a doorway, moving from one viewer to the next. The husband had tried to capture it, to contain it in his self-portrait, but it had taken him instead. And now it's looking for someone else. Someone who will notice it, pay attention to it, give it the recognition it needs to fully emerge. I hope whoever finds the painting next is stronger than I was. I hope they have the courage to look away while they still can. But I doubt it. The figure is patient, persistent. It knows how to wait, how to move so slowly that you don't notice until it's too late. And once you've seen it, really sign it, it never stops watching you back. Crime 14, the notebook was old, brittle pages, yellowed edges, but the handwriting was mine. Same pressure, same loops, same slant, but I'd never written those words. It was a list, not of things to do, but of events, things that had already happened, some small, like breaking a glass, others impossible, like the call I hadn't made yet. Each day another entry appeared in my writing. I burned the notebook, watched it turn to ash. The next morning there was another one, and the next line read, "You burned the first copy." I should have left it there, should have walked away and never looked back, but something about seeing my own handwriting describing events I couldn't remember made my chest tight. The kind of pressure that builds behind your ribs when you know something is wrong but can't name it. The second notebook sat on my kitchen table for hours before I touched it. Coffee grew cold, toast went stale. I circled around it like it might bite, studying the familiar curve of my letters from a distance. The paper smelled of dust and something else, something metallic that made my nose wrinkle. When I finally opened it, my hands were shaking. The first entry was dated 3 weeks ago. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the words felt foreign in my mouth when I read them aloud. She asked about the basement again, told her the door was stuck. I don't remember anyone asking about any basement. I don't even have a basement. But as I read further, fragments started surfacing. A woman with dark hair and nervous fingers. She'd been asking questions about the previous owner of my house, someone who disappeared without forwarding address or explanation. The realtor had glossed over it during the sale, mentioning only that the property had been vacant for months. The next entry made my stomach drop. Found her phone in the garden, battery still warm. I set the notebook down and walked outside. The garden was overgrown, wild roses tangled with weeds. I'd been meaning to clean it up since moving in, but something always stopped me. Now I knelt in the damp earth, pushing aside thorny branches, and there it was, a phone, screen cracked but still functional. The last number dialed was mine. I scrolled through the messages, texts to friends about meeting someone who knew about the missing person, plans to visit my address, the final message, sent but never delivered. Something's not right here, the story doesn't add up. My hands were covered in dirt, under my fingernails, specks of something darker. I rushed inside to wash them, scrubbing until the skin was raw. The water ran brown, then pink, then clear. The notebook was still open on the table. I read the next entry, washing hands again, third time today. The guilt is eating at me. I hadn't written that, I wouldn't write that, but the handwriting was identical to my own, down to the way I crossed my T's and dotted my I's. Even the ink looked familiar, the same blue pen I kept by my bedside. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake listening to the house settle, wondering if those creaking sounds were footsteps in the attic. The notebook grew thicker each night. New pages appeared, filled with entries that read like confessions to crimes I didn't remember committing. Moved the car to the other side of town, wiped down the interior. The smell from the basement is getting stronger. Called in sick to work, can't face people right now. I checked my phone records. Sure enough, I'd called in sick on the date mentioned. I told my boss I had food poisoning, but I felt fine that day. At least I thought I had. The car was another shock. I found it exactly where the notebook said it would be, in a parking lot across town, keys under the floor mat. The interior smelled of bleach and something underneath it that made my eyes water. In the trunk, cleaning supplies I didn't remember buying, rubber gloves, plastic sheeting. I drove home in a daze, the notebook's latest entry echoing in my mind, starting to remember pieces. The basement door was never stuck. The basement door, I'd avoided it since moving in, assuming it was just storage space. But now I stood in front of it, key trembling in my hand. The lock turned easily, too easily. The smell hit me first, earth and decay, and something sweet that made my stomach lurch. The stairs were wooden, old, each step groaning under my weight. At the bottom, a bare bulb cast harsh shadows on concrete walls. She was there, the woman with dark hair and nervous fingers. She wasn't asking questions anymore. I backed up the stairs, nearly falling, slamming the door behind me. My breathing came in short gasps. I grabbed the notebook with shaking hands, flipping to the latest entry. Found her in the basement, just like I knew I would. The handwriting was still mine, but now I could feel the memory surfacing, not all at once, but in fragments. Her knocking on my door, questions about the previous owner, how she'd pushed past me when I tried to close the door, the argument, the push down the stairs. But that wasn't right either. The timeline was wrong. The notebook showed entries from before she died, talking about guilt and cleanup, as if I'd known what was going to happen. I called the police, told them about the body, about the notebook, about the handwriting I couldn't explain. They found her exactly where I said she'd be. The forensics team worked for hours, bagging evidence, taking photos. But when they tested the notebook, something strange happened. The ink was fresh, written within the last few days, all of it, even the entries dated weeks ago. The detective assigned to the case had tired eyes and coffee stains on his shirt. He listened to my story with the patience of someone who'd heard every excuse. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "The problem is," he said, "your story doesn't match the physical evidence. The victim died 3 weeks ago. The notebook entries are recent, and your fingerprints are on everything." I tried to explain about the handwriting, about the memories that didn't feel like mine, but even as I spoke, I could hear how it sounded, desperate, guilty. "The handwriting analysis came back," he continued. "It's yours, no question, but here's what's interesting. There are signs of forgery. Someone practiced copying your handwriting, got very good at it." He slid a photograph across the table. It showed pages from the notebook under magnification. Tiny differences in pressure, slight variations in letter formation that were invisible to the naked eye. "Someone wanted us to think you wrote this. The question is why?" I stared at the photo, my mind racing. If I hadn't written the notebook, who had? And why make it look like a confession to a crime I might not have committed? The detective's next words made my blood freeze. "We found something else in the basement. Another notebook, hidden behind a loose brick. Want to tell me about that one?" I had no memory of any other notebook, but when he brought it out, I recognized the handwriting immediately. Not mine this time, someone else's. The entries were different too. Not confessions, but plans, detailed descriptions of how to frame someone for murder, how to plant evidence, how to make it look convincing. The final entry was dated the day before I found the first notebook. Phase 1 complete. He'll find the notebook tomorrow and do exactly what I've planned. The guilt will eat at him until he confesses to something he didn't do. The handwriting was familiar, but I couldn't place it. Something about the way the letters curved, the particular slant of the words. I'd seen it before, but where? As I was led back to my cell, one more detail surfaced. The woman who died, I'd seen her before too. Not at my door asking questions, but somewhere else. In a coffee shop maybe, or a library. She'd been writing in a notebook, her dark hair falling across her face as she worked. The same handwriting, the same nervous fingers. But that would mean she'd written the plan to frame me, which made no sense if she was the victim. Unless she wasn't the victim at all. I asked to see the crime scene photos again. The detective was reluctant, but eventually agreed. I studied each image carefully, looking for something I'd missed. The woman in the basement looked like the one who'd come to my door. Same hair, same build, but something was off about her face. "Can you check dental records?" I asked. The detective raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I don't think that's her." 2 days later, the results came back. The woman in the basement wasn't the person who'd visited my house. She was someone else entirely, a local woman who'd been reported missing 6 months ago. The real question was, where was the woman who'd written the notebook? I started remembering more details. The woman at my door had been wearing gloves. She'd been careful not to touch anything except the door frame. and when she'd pushed past me, she'd gone straight to the basement door as if she already knew where it was. The handwriting analysis was rerun, this time comparing all three samples, the planted notebook, the planning notebook, and samples of my own writing. The results were disturbing. The planning notebook showed two different handwritings. One belonged to the woman who'd visited my house. The other was mine. Real entries in my handwriting mixed with her forgeries, as if we'd been collaborating. But I had no memory of that collaboration, no memory of planning a murder or helping to frame myself for it. The final piece came from security footage at the coffee shop where I'd first seen her. The timestamp showed us meeting multiple times over several weeks. In the footage, we appeared to be working together, sharing notebooks, discussing plans. I watched myself nod and smile and take notes. I watched myself hand over samples of my own handwriting. I watched myself become an accomplice to my own framing. But I remembered none of it. The detective closed the case with a theory that fit the evidence. I'd helped plan the murder, then developed selective amnesia when the guilt became too much. The woman who'd visited my house had been my accomplice, and she disappeared after the crime, leaving me to take the blame. It was neat, it was logical, it explained everything. Except for one detail that still bothers me late at night in my cell. In the final security footage, just before the woman leaves the coffee shop for the last time, she turns back and looks directly at the camera. She's smiling. And for just a moment, she looks exactly like me. Not similar, not related, identical. The same face, the same expressions, the same way of moving, as if I'd been meeting with myself all along. But that's impossible, isn't it? I've been writing this account in my own handwriting, checking each word against my memory. But now I'm wondering, when I look at these pages tomorrow, will I recognize the writing as mine? Or will it seem foreign, like someone else's thoughts in my familiar script? The woman in the basement is still dead. Someone killed her. Someone wrote those notebooks. Someone planned the perfect frame. I just can't shake the feeling that all of those someones might be me. Crime 15, I was pulling weeds near the fence when I saw the ground rise slightly, like something underneath had exhaled. The soil shifted just for a moment, then it stilled. I stared at it, waiting for it to move again. Nothing, but when I dug, the dirt was warm, too warm, like something had been nesting just beneath the surface. Deeper down, I found pieces of cloth, strips of something that had once been red, torn and knotted. I buried it all again, tamped the earth down with shaking hands, but now birds won't land there. And at night, the grass bends in strange directions. That was 3 months ago. I should have called someone then. I should have done a lot of things differently. But when you find something like that in your own backyard, your first instinct isn't to involve others. Your first instinct is to pretend it never happened. The house had been empty for 2 years before I moved in. The previous owner had left suddenly, according to the neighbor with the crooked smile who brought me cookies that first week. She mentioned how the woman had packed everything in one afternoon, leaving behind only the garden tools and a few pieces of furniture too heavy to move alone. I found those tools in the shed, rusted but functional. The shovel was the heaviest, its blade worn smooth from use. Too smooth, I thought later, like it had been cleaning itself against something harder than dirt. The backyard was overgrown when I arrived. Weeds strangled what had once been flower beds, and the grass grew in patches, thick in some places, completely bare in others. The bare spots formed an almost perfect circle near the back fence, where the dirt stayed darker than the rest of the yard, even during the driest days. I started working on the garden because I needed something to do with my hands. The silence in the house was too complete, too expectant. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The first thing I noticed was the smell, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong, like earth mixed with something sweet and metallic. It was strongest near the fence, where the ground had that strange give to it, like walking on a mattress instead of solid earth. I told myself it was just old compost. The previous owner had probably buried kitchen scraps there, but when I turned the soil, I found no decomposing vegetables, no coffee grounds or eggshells, just that warm, yielding dirt that seemed to breathe beneath my feet. The cloth pieces were small, no bigger than my palm. The red had faded to a rust color, but I could still make out a pattern, tiny flowers, delicate and feminine. The fabric felt expensive between my fingers, silk or something close to it. The knots were tight, deliberate. Someone had tied them with purpose. I sat in the dirt holding those pieces, trying to understand what I was looking at. The logical part of my mind suggested reasonable explanations. Maybe the previous owner had buried old clothes there. Maybe she'd used them as garden ties for plants that had long since died. Maybe the warmth was just decomposition, natural and harmless. But the knots bothered me. They were too perfect, too intentional. And there were so many of them, scattered through the soil like confetti after a party no one remembered attending. I wrapped the pieces in newspaper and put them in the kitchen drawer next to the receipts and takeout menus. I told myself I'd throw them away later, but I never did. Instead, I found myself taking them out sometimes, spreading them across the counter, trying to piece together what they had once been. The neighbor with the crooked smile stopped by again the next week. She stood at my back door, looking past me into the yard, her eyes lingering on the spot where I'd been digging. "You're working on the garden," she said. It wasn't a question. "Just trying to clean it up a bit." The previous owner loved that garden. She spent most of her time out there, especially toward the end. Her smile flickered before she got sick. I hadn't heard about any illness. What kind of sick? The kind that makes you forget things, important things. She paused, still looking at the backyard. She used to talk to herself out there, long conversations with someone I could never see. Probably just thinking out loud while she worked. Maybe the woman's eyes met mine, but she always sounded like she was apologizing. After she left, I stood in the kitchen, staring out at the yard. The dark circle of earth looked smaller in the daylight, less ominous, just a garden bed that needed attention. But I couldn't shake the image of a woman standing there alone, having conversations with the air, her voice heavy with regret. I started researching the previous owner. Public records showed she'd lived in the house for 15 years, had worked as a secretary at a law firm downtown. No family listed, no emergency contacts, just a woman who'd existed quietly until she didn't. The law firm had closed 6 months after she left. The building was being torn down, but I found the owner's number and called him. He remembered her, said she'd been a good employee until she started missing work. She'd become distracted, jumpy. She'd started talking about things that didn't make sense. What kind of things? She kept saying she'd done something wrong, that she needed to fix it, but she couldn't remember what it was. We thought maybe it was the early stages of dementia, but she was too young for that. Did she ever mention her garden? There was a pause. She asked me once if I thought plants could forgive. I told her plants don't hold grudges. She started crying right there in the office. The conversation stayed with me. I found myself spending more time in the backyard, not gardening but just standing there, trying to understand what I'd inherited along with the house. The warm spot in the earth had grown, not dramatically, but enough that I could feel it when I walked across the yard. The grass around it was coming back, growing thicker and greener than anywhere else, too green, like it was feeding on something rich beneath the surface. I started having dreams about the previous owner. In them, she was younger, nailing in the dirt with her hands covered in soil. She was burying something carefully, methodically. When she looked up at me, her eyes were desperate. I couldn't leave her there, she would say. She was so cold. I would wake up with the taste of earth in my mouth. The dreams made me dig again, not in the same spot, but around it, expanding the circle. I found more cloth pieces and something else. A small silver chain, tarnished but intact. A locket that wouldn't open, no matter how I tried to pry it apart. The chain was delicate, feminine, the kind of thing a young woman might wear every day, unconsciously touching it when she was nervous or thinking. The metal was warm against my palm, as if it had been recently worn. I took it to a jeweler. He examined it under his magnifying glass, turning it over in his hands. "This is old," he said, "handcrafted, probably from the 1980s. See how the links are soldered? They don't make them like this anymore. Can you open it?" He tried several tools, but the locket remained sealed. "It's been damaged," he said finally. "Like someone tried to weld it shut. I could cut it open, but I'd destroy the mechanism." I left it intact. Something about forcing it open felt wrong, like violating a secret that wasn't mine to know. Back home, I called the police, not to report a crime, but to ask about missing persons from the area. The officer who answered was helpful but not encouraging. "We'd need more than fabric scraps and a necklace to open an investigation," he said. "People lose things in their yards all the time, and without a specific person to look for, there's not much we can do." What if someone was buried there? Has there been any structural damage to your property? Settling foundation, sinkholes, anything like that? There hadn't been. The house was solid, the yard stable except for that one soft spot that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "Look," the officer said, "if you're really concerned, you could hire a private company to do ground-penetrating radar. But that's expensive, and honestly, you'd probably just find old septic lines or tree roots." I didn't hire anyone. Instead, I started watching the yard more carefully. The birds still avoided the area, but other animals didn't. Cats would come and sit at the edge of the warm spot, not on it but close enough to feel whatever heat rose from below. They would stay there for hours, absolutely still, like they were keeping vigil. The neighbor with the crooked smile stopped by again. This time she didn't look at the backyard. She kept her eyes on my face. "You found something," she said. I didn't ask how she knew, just some old fabric, probably nothing. She used to wear red dresses, the previous owner, always red, like she was trying to be noticed by someone specific. "Did she have visitors?" "Not that I saw, but she had a daughter once, a long time ago before she moved here. I only know because she mentioned it once when she was drunk. Said the girl had run away when she was 16, never came back." "What was the daughter's name?" The woman's smile faded completely. She never said, but she talked about her like she was dead. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the locket warm against my palm, about a woman who wore red dresses and talked to the air, about a daughter who had run away and never come back. I went outside and stood in the backyard. The moon was bright enough that I could see the shape of the warm spot clearly. It was bigger now, definitely bigger, and the grass there was so green it almost glowed. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the ground. I don't know what I expected to hear. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But there was something, a sound like breathing deep and slow, like someone sleeping peacefully after a long, exhausting day. I stayed there until dawn, listening to the earth breathe. When the sun came up, I went inside and made coffee with shaking hands. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it all. The sound, the warmth, the way the grass seemed to reach toward my face when I got close. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew what it meant. Someone was down there, someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to find them. Someone who had been alone in the dark, wrapped in torn red silk, while the woman who put them there lived above, gardening around their grave, talking to them like they could still hear. I never called the police again. I never hired the ground-penetrating radar company. I never told anyone else what I'd found. Instead, I bought flowers, roses, because they seemed appropriate. I planted them in a perfect circle around the warm spot, creating a garden that was both beautiful and purposeful, a memorial that looked like decoration. The roses grew impossibly well, big red blooms that lasted longer than roses should. People commented on them, said I must have a natural gift for gardening. I never corrected them. Sometimes late at night I still hear the breathing, but it sounds different now, less restless, like whoever is down there knows they haven't been forgotten. The locket sits on my kitchen table, still sealed. I touch it sometimes when I'm drinking my morning coffee and looking out at the garden. It's still warm, still keeping whatever secrets it holds. I think about the previous owner sometimes, wonder where she went when she left so suddenly. Whether she found peace, or whether she's still out there somewhere, carrying the weight of what she did. And I think about the daughter who ran away and never came back, whether she's still running, or whether she's exactly where she always was, sleeping in the warm earth, finally home. The birds still won't land there, but the cats keep coming, keeping their silent vigil, and the grass keeps growing green and thick and alive, fed by secrets I'll never fully understand. I've become the caretaker of something I never asked for, a keeper of mysteries that aren't mine to solve. But every morning when I look out at the roses, I feel like I'm doing something important, something necessary. The earth doesn't breathe anymore. It rests, quiet and still, like it's finally found what it was looking for. And maybe that's enough. Crime 16, it didn't make sense. I'd leaned the bookshelf against the wall when I moved in. It had been flat, no recess, no draft, but yesterday I felt a breeze through the wood. I pulled it away and found a narrow door. No handle, just a small round hole where one might have been. The wood around it was splintered, like someone had tried to claw their way out. I haven't opened it. I don't think I ever will. But last night when I came downstairs, the bookshelf had been pushed forward a few inches. And the breeze was colder than before. The real estate agent hadn't mentioned anything about hidden doors. She'd been nervous during the showing, constantly checking her phone, avoiding eye contact when I asked about the previous owner. The house had been on the market for 18 months, unusually long for this neighborhood. The price had dropped 3 times. I called her that morning. Her voice tightened when I explained what I'd found. I'm not aware of any structural modifications, she said. The disclosure was complete. Perhaps it's just a utility access panel. But utility panels don't have locks, and they don't emanate that particular smell, something metallic and organic, like pennies left in damp soil. I started researching the property records. The house had changed hands frequently over the past decade. 5 different owners, all selling within 2 years. The city planning office had no record of any permits for interior renovations. The original blueprints from 1987 showed no door in that location. The previous owner's name was listed in the documents. I found his contact information through a public records search. He lived across town now in a small apartment. When I called, he answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting. "You found it," he said before I could explain why I was calling. His voice carried a weight I couldn't identify, fear maybe, or relief. We met at a coffee shop near his apartment. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with dark circles under his eyes and hands that never stopped moving. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. "I sealed it," he said, "used wood glue, painted over the cracks, thought that would be enough." "Enough for what?" He studied my face for a long moment. "You haven't opened it." "No, good, don't." He told me about the night sounds, scratching like fingernails on wood, how his dog refused to go near that wall, how he'd wake up to find scratches on the other side of the door, fresh wood shavings on the floor. "I researched the history," he said. "The family who lived there before me had a daughter. She disappeared. Police assumed she ran away. Troubled teenager, history of behavioral issues. They never found her." The coffee shop felt suddenly cold. I wrapped my hands around my cup, seeking warmth. "When did this happen?" "About 8 years ago. The parents moved out 6 months later. Couldn't handle the memories, the questions. The house sat empty for a while after that." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were photocopied newspaper clippings, police reports, and what looked like personal documents. The headlines were stark: "Local teen missing. Search continues for missing girl. Case goes cold." The girl's photo showed someone ordinary, brown hair, slight smile, the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd. But there was something in her eyes, a hardness that seemed inappropriate for her age. Her parents said she'd been acting strange in the months before she disappeared, talking to herself, claiming someone was watching her. They thought it was typical teenage drama. I flipped through the police reports. Multiple calls to the house in the year before her disappearance. Disturbances, neighbors reporting screaming. Each report was marked unfounded or unable to verify. "What do you think happened to her?" He leaned back in his chair. "I think she's still in the house." The words hung between us like a challenge. I wanted to dismiss them as the paranoid ramblings of someone who'd been alone too long, but the certainty in his voice made me uncomfortable. "The police searched the house," I said. "They would have found any hiding places." "Would they? How thoroughly do you think they searched? A teenage runaway isn't exactly a priority case. And that door, it's not obvious. You only found it because you moved the bookshelf." I thought about the splintered wood around the lock mechanism. The scratches looked fresh, not 8 years old. "Why didn't you tell the police about the door?" I tried. They said they'd investigated thoroughly. Besides, what was I supposed to tell them? That I heard scratching, that my dog was scared. They'd already classified her as a runaway. He gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope. I couldn't live with it anymore. The sounds, the smell, the way the house felt wrong. I moved out and never looked back.
But you sealed the door.
I tried to. Maybe I didn't do it right. Maybe some things can't be sealed. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. The papers felt heavier than they should have, weighted with implications I didn't want to consider. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway. The windows seemed darker, the shadows longer. I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the front door, trying to rationalize what I'd learned. Inside, the bookshelf was exactly where I'd left it. The door behind it remained closed, but the smell was stronger now, that metallic, organic scent that seemed to seep through the wood. I spread the documents on my kitchen table and began reading more carefully. The girl's behavioral changes had started gradually. Her grades dropped. She became withdrawn, paranoid. Her parents mentioned finding her talking to empty rooms, claiming someone was trying to get her attention. A school counselor's report noted increasing signs of psychological distress and recommended professional evaluation. The appointment was scheduled for the week after she disappeared. The final police report was brief. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, personal belongings missing, suggesting voluntary departure, case suspended pending new information. But there was a detail buried in the witness statements that caught my attention. A neighbor reported seeing the girl in her backyard the night before she was reported missing. She was digging near the foundation of the house using a garden trowel. When asked about it, she claimed to be making a door. I set the papers aside and walked to the living room. The bookshelf stood against the wall like a guardian, protecting something that shouldn't be protected. The wood floor beneath it was unmarked, but when I knelt down, I could see faint scratches in the hardwood, as if something had been dragged across it repeatedly. The breeze was stronger now. I could feel it through the bookshelf, carrying that strange smell and something else, the faintest sound of movement. Not scratching, more like breathing. I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher was polite but disinterested. Cold cases weren't emergencies. They'd make a note and have someone contact me within a few days. That night I moved my bed to the upstairs guest room as far from the hidden door as possible. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The heating system cycling on and off, the foundation settling, and underneath it all, that persistent scratching. I went downstairs. The bookshelf had moved again, not much, maybe an inch, but enough to create a wider gap. The door was still closed, but I could see scratches in the wood that hadn't been there before. Fresh scratches, with wood shavings scattered on the floor. I thought about calling the previous owner, but what would I say? That his story was true, that whatever he'd tried to seal away was still there, still trying to get out. Instead, I did what he had done. I pushed the bookshelf back against the wall, harder this time, and wedged it in place with furniture movers. Then I bought wood glue and caulk from the hardware store and sealed every gap I could find. It worked for 3 days. On the 4th morning, I woke to the sound of wood splintering. The bookshelf had been pushed forward again, but this time the door was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to see darkness beyond. The smell hit me immediately, stronger now, almost overwhelming. And there was something else, the sound of shallow breathing, like someone who'd been holding their breath for a very long time. I should have called the police then, should have demanded they reopen the case, search the house properly, investigate what everyone had been too quick to dismiss. But something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of what they might find, or maybe it was the fear of what they might not find. Because if there was nothing behind that door, if it was just an old utility access covered by decades of paint and neglect, then what did that say about the sounds I'd been hearing? The scratches that appeared overnight, the way the house felt like it was holding its breath. I closed the door and pushed the bookshelf back into place, but I didn't seal it this time. Some part of me knew it wouldn't work. Some part of me was beginning to understand that whatever was behind that door had been waiting patiently for someone to find it. And now that someone was me. The girl in the newspaper photo stared back at me from the kitchen table. Brown hair, slight smile, hard eyes. She'd been 17 when she disappeared. She'd be 25 now if she was still alive. But I was beginning to suspect she wasn't alive, and I was beginning to suspect she wasn't gone either. Tonight I'll push the bookshelf aside. I'll open the door and see what's been waiting behind it for 8 years. Because the alternative, living with the sounds, the smells, the constant sense that something is trying to get my attention, is worse than knowing the truth. Even if the truth is something I'm not ready to face. Even if the truth is that some disappearances aren't disappearances at all. The scratching has stopped. The house is quiet now, holding its breath again, waiting. And so am I. Crime 17, everything inside was wrong. Jars with no labels. Milk in glass bottles I don't remember purchasing. Meat sealed in brown paper, still damp to the touch. I emptied the entire fridge, cleaned every shelf, restocked with things I bought myself. The next day it was all back, exactly as it had been before. The same unlabeled jars, the same strange bottles. One of them had a smudge across the glass that looked like a fingerprint. Not mine. Now I keep the fridge chained shut. I eat elsewhere, but the hum never stops. And neither does the smell. I work as a forensic accountant. My job is finding discrepancies that others miss, numbers that don't add up, patterns that reveal hidden truths. I've spent years training my mind to notice what doesn't belong. But this wasn't about numbers anymore. The apartment came furnished when I moved in. The previous tenant had left suddenly, according to the landlord. Personal emergency, he'd said, left behind most of their belongings. The fridge was one of those old models with the curved edges and chrome handles. It worked perfectly, kept everything cold. Until it started keeping things I never put there. The first week I attributed it to stress. New job, new city, new routine. Maybe I was forgetting my own grocery runs. The mind plays tricks when you're adjusting to change. But forensic work teaches you to document everything, so I started taking photos. The unlabeled jars contained what looked like preserves, dark, thick substances that could have been jam or something else entirely. The consistency was wrong for any fruit I knew. When I opened one, the smell hit me immediately, sweet, but with an underlying sourness that made my stomach turn. I threw them all away, sanitized the shelves with bleach. The chemical smell was harsh but clean, reassuring in its familiarity. But they returned. Same jars, same contents, same placement on the middle shelf. The glass bottles of milk had a cream line that seemed too thick, too yellow. The meat packages were wrapped in butcher paper, tied with string in a way that suggested care, attention to detail. Someone had access to my apartment. I changed the locks immediately, added a security camera pointed at the kitchen, installed motion sensors. The building had electronic key cards, supposedly secure. I reviewed the access logs with building management. My card was the only one used for my unit. The camera footage showed nothing unusual, just me entering and leaving, opening the fridge, staring at its contents with growing confusion. The timestamp showed continuous recording, no gaps or edits. Yet the food kept appearing. I started eating out exclusively, avoided the kitchen entirely except to check the fridge. Each inspection revealed the same inventory unchanged. The meat packages never seemed to age or spoil. The milk never soured. The preserves maintained their strange consistency. During my lunch break, I researched the building's history. Nothing unusual in the public records. Standard residential construction, no reported incidents. I pulled the property management files through a contact at the courthouse. The previous tenant's name was redacted in most documents, but I found a forwarding address on an old utility transfer form. The address led to a funeral home. I called during business hours, identifying myself as someone trying to reach the former tenant about personal belongings left behind. The funeral director's voice was careful, professional. They confirmed the person had worked there briefly as a preservation technician, left without notice about 2 months ago. The same time frame as when I moved in. I asked about the nature of the work. Standard mortuary procedures, the director explained. Body preparation, chemical preservation, maintaining cold storage. Nothing unusual about the employment or departure, just sudden and unexplained. The connection felt significant but incomplete. Someone with access to preservation chemicals and cold storage techniques had lived in my apartment, had left behind a refrigerator that continued to receive mysterious food items. I returned to the apartment that evening with new purpose. Instead of avoiding the kitchen, I examined everything more closely. The fridge itself was older than I'd initially thought. The serial number had been scratched off, but the model suggested manufacture from decades past. Inside, I noticed details I'd missed before. The shelves showed wear patterns that didn't match normal food storage, circular stains that could have been from containers of different sizes. The back wall had subtle discoloration, patches where something had been repeatedly placed and removed. The meat packages drew my attention again. The paper wrapping was professional quality, the kind used in specialty butcher shops or institutional kitchens. But the string was tied in a particular pattern, a specific knot that seemed purposeful rather than random. I photographed everything from multiple angles, measured the packages, documented their exact placement, applied the same methodical approach I used in financial investigations. The pattern became clearer. The items weren't random. They were organized according to some system I didn't understand. The jars were arranged by size, not content. The bottles were positioned to allow maximum visibility of their contents. The meat packages were sorted by what appeared to be weight or density. Someone was using my refrigerator as storage, but storage for what? I researched preservation techniques used in funeral homes. Formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, various alcohols and glycols. Chemical compounds that could maintain organic materials indefinitely under proper conditions. The unlabeled jars could easily contain such substances. The realization was gradual but unavoidable. I wasn't dealing with ordinary food storage. This was something else entirely, something that required specific temperature control and chemical treatment. I contacted the building's maintenance supervisor, asked about the apartment's electrical usage patterns. The refrigerator was drawing significantly more power than normal, running almost continuously. The temperature logs showed constant fluctuation, as if the unit was working to maintain very specific conditions. The supervisor mentioned that the previous tenant had requested modifications to the kitchen wiring. Additional outlets increased amperage, claimed it was for professional equipment related to their work in food preservation. Food preservation, that was the story they'd told. But I knew better now. The fingerprint on the glass bottle wasn't from casual handling. It was from repeated, careful manipulation. The kind of touch that comes from professional experience with delicate materials. I decided to test my theory, left the apartment for 3 days, staying at a hotel, returned with a colleague who specialized in chemical analysis. We opened the refrigerator wearing protective equipment, treating it like a potential hazard site. The jars contained preservative solutions. The milk bottles held what appeared to be embalming fluid mixed with other compounds. The meat packages were the most disturbing organic tissue samples, preserved in various chemical solutions. My colleague suggested immediate police involvement. This wasn't food storage, it was specimen preservation. The kind used in medical or mortuary settings, but conducted in a residential environment without proper permits or oversight. But I hesitated. The evidence was circumstantial. The previous tenant was gone, no forwarding address beyond the funeral home. The building management claimed no knowledge of unusual activities. Without clear proof of criminal intent, the police would likely treat it as a civil matter. I began my own investigation instead. The funeral home director was reluctant to discuss the former employee in detail. Privacy concerns, he claimed, but I pressed, explaining the situation with the apartment and the continued appearance of preservation materials. His demeanor changed, became more guarded, almost fearful. He admitted the employee had been terminated for policy violations, taking materials home, using company equipment for unauthorized purposes. They'd suspected illegal activity but couldn't prove it. The violations involved missing chemicals, unaccounted specimens, and equipment that disappeared from inventory. The employee had access to the preparation facilities after hours, claimed to be working on professional development projects. But the projects were never documented. The missing materials were never recovered. I asked about the specific chemicals found in my refrigerator. The director's face went pale. Those particular combinations weren't used in standard mortuary practice. They were specialized solutions, the kind used for long-term preservation of organic materials. Research purposes, he suggested, or worse. I pressed for details about what worse might mean. The director hesitated, then explained that certain preservation techniques could be used to maintain biological evidence indefinitely. Crime scene materials, for instance, or materials that someone wanted to keep from decomposing while avoiding detection. The implication was clear. My refrigerator wasn't just storing preserved specimens. It was potentially storing evidence of criminal activity. I returned to the apartment with new urgency. The police needed to be involved now, regardless of the complexities. But when I opened the refrigerator, it was empty, completely clean, as if it had never contained anything unusual. The shelves were spotless. No stains, no odors, no trace of the materials I'd documented so carefully. Even the wear patterns had been scrubbed away. Someone had been watching, had known about my investigation and removed everything before I could present it to authorities. I checked the security footage again. The cameras showed only me entering and leaving, no other activity, no sign of intrusion. But the timestamp showed a gap I hadn't noticed before, several hours missing from the recording during my hotel stay. The gap was professionally done, not a malfunction but a deliberate edit, removing evidence of whoever had accessed the apartment during my absence. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a former tenant who'd left behind strange materials. I was dealing with someone who was still active, still monitoring the situation, still using my apartment for purposes I couldn't fully understand. The police report I filed was polite but dismissive. No physical evidence, no identifiable suspect, no clear indication of criminal activity. They suggested changing the locks again and installing additional security measures. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever was responsible had access that transcended normal security. They had knowledge of my schedule, my investigation, my every move. I decided to leave the apartment, found a new place across town, told no one the address, left the refrigerator chained shut as I described to the police, let the building management deal with whatever was inside. But the smell followed me. Not physically, there was no logical way for that to happen, but in my memory, in my dreams, in quiet moments when I thought I was safe. The smell of preservation chemicals mixed with something organic, something that shouldn't have been preserved, something that someone had wanted to keep from decomposing, from being discovered, from revealing its secrets. I still work as a forensic accountant, still find discrepancies others miss, but now I know that some discrepancies are intentional. Some patterns are designed to hide truth rather than reveal it. And some investigations are better left unfinished. The refrigerator is still there in my old apartment. The new tenant hasn't complained about unusual food items. The building management claims everything is normal. But I know better. I know that some things never really end. They just wait, preserved in chemical solutions, maintained at exact temperatures, ready to be discovered by the next person who looks too closely. The next person who notices what doesn't belong. The next person who opens the wrong door.